Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started here. If everyone can kind of settle into their places. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. I hear that there are travel delays occurring, both flight delays with some of our speakers, one of whom is still stuck on the ground in Atlanta, but also driving delays because, as we all know, in Washington, for some reason, there is a collective panic attack that people have in Washington whenever it rains. I don't understand it. I've been here for 20 years, but when it rains, people turn into total fruitcakes when they drive. I don't get it. Someone's got to do a psychological analysis at some point. It's lovely to see you all. We could have gone for an even bigger room than this, but we wanted to keep this a tight gathering of people who are dear to us and are very involved in these causes. So great to see you all. We gather here today to focus on ways to strengthen American elections. While we have many causes for concern, we also have reasons for optimism. 3 weeks ago, voters across the country delivered a strong message to those who don't support free and fair elections. They said, basically, we don't want you in positions of power. Many of them split their tickets to do so, voting, for instance, for the Republican governor in Nevada, but against the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. These sophisticated, smart voters and their clear concern for democracy are incredibly reassuring for many of us, I'm sure. As I look around this room, many of us are together for the first time since the pandemic hit. Despite the challenges, many of you played critical roles in the fight to defend our elections in the last 2 cycles. National Council on Election Integrity members have stood tall since we formed the group in the late summer of 2020. Many of you have received threats for the work that you have done for us. Many of you have had to take on members of your own party, and all of you have leveraged your time and your reputations on behalf of our democracy. NCAI members are equal number of Democrats and Republicans. You are members of Congress, you are cabinet secretaries, you are military leaders, you are political party chiefs, secretaries of state, and election workers. You represent the best of America as you put our country and our sacred Constitution above your party affiliations. Your commitment to the cause reminds me of one of my favorite Ronald Reagan quotes. Quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it on to them with the well-taught lessons of how they, in their lifetime, must do the same." As we look ahead to 2024, NCEI members will continue to be vocal protectors and defenders of the sacred freedom to vote. I'd like to take a moment to honor all the NCAI members in this room, so if y'all could please just stand up for a second. We'd love to at least clap for you, now that we're not only on Zoom boxes. While we're recognizing leaders, I'd love to take a moment to also acknowledge the chair of Issue One's board, Whitney Hatch, right here, who essentially co-founded the organization with me and has spent many, many hours and many dollars defending our democracy and protecting our public lands. So thank you, Whitney, for your incredible dedication to this organization. So, about the work ahead. Now is not the time for us to take our foot off the gas. Just a few blocks away, Congress is working feverishly on an ambitious list of end-of-the-year priorities, including critical updates to the Electoral Count Act. We at Issue One, along with many of you in this room, have been working hard on these updates since January 7th of 2021. Our very own Elise Workus, there's Elise back there, has helped get the football down to the 1-yard line, and now we just need Congress to ram it into the end zone. We're fortunate enough that we will have 2 sitting senators speaking with us today who played an instrumental role in moving this landmark piece of legislation forward. Of course, Senator Joe Manchin, also Amy Klobuchar will be joining us later. Thanks to their tenacity and their leadership in close partnership with Senator Collins and other Democrats, Republicans, and independents, because Senator King played a great role too, The ECA reform has garnered widespread bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. It's probably one of the few things that Senators McConnell and Schumer fervently agree on. We are also here today to reflect on the midterm election results as well as the threats and challenges that remain as we look ahead to 2024, and we will talk about the debt of gratitude we all owe to our amazing election workers and poll workers across the country who once again, under very difficult circumstances, including death threats to them and their families, conducted another safe and secure election. This is also a wonderful time for us to not be on Zoom boxes and meeting in person because it happens to be the 10-year anniversary of Issue 1 itself, which I'm very proud of. So just allow me a moment of organizational pride. When I left my career in journalism, in fact, I was just reflecting with John Bridgeland and some others on what a wonderful and amazing place this was when I was a reporter. It was just, you all remember, it was a buzz. Reporters had offices here. They'd be roaming the halls, the best reporters, the most colorful columnists would be walking around on a daily basis. So this place has still a sacred quality for me. But nonetheless, I left journalism 10 years ago to found Issue 1. And since then, we have collectively garnered more than 3,000 press hits as an organization. And by the way, those are genuine press hits. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations who will get a piece that'll be done by the Associated Press that'll run in 12 papers, and they'll say, oh, we got 12 press hits, right? These are 3,000 individualized press hits. We've published more than 300 op-eds in newspapers across the country. We've logged hundreds of meetings on Capitol Hill. I can tell you that in 2019, before the pandemic hit, we did 259 meetings on the Hill, the majority of which were with Republican offices, thanks to Zach Wamp and Tim Romer and our amazing legislative team for all that. We have recruited more than 350 national leaders and luminaries to our various committees and groups. We have backed multiple bipartisan bills in Congress. Many of them have passed. And along the way, we've formed amazing communities, from our Faces of Democracy heroes, who you will hear from today, to our Reformers Caucus, which has 200 former members of Congress. It is the largest organization of former members of Congress outside of the Association of Former Members of Congress, roughly half Republican, half Democrat, to the 47 members of our recently launched Council for Responsible Social Media, and of course, to the National Council on Election Integrity. Our cross-partisan approach remains at the center of everything we do. It is not easy, as we all know, to be cross-partisan or bipartisan these days, but it is essential to us, and we believe that it is the only way to advance lasting change. So, the NCI has 4 capable co-chairs: Ambassador Tim Romer, a Democrat; Congressman Zach Wamp, a Republican; Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, a Republican; and Congresswoman Donna Edwards, a Democrat. You will hear from all of them today, starting with Donna. Donna, who was a fierce advocate for her constituents in Maryland's 4th Congressional District, is today an equally fierce advocate for American democracy. Donna, we are so grateful to have you here to lend your intellect and energy to our cause. So thank you, Donna.
They want me to come with you. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Kelly.
While we get settled here, good morning. Well, it's actually really great to see all of your faces and from the top to the floor. And welcome again. I'm Donna Edwards. I am a co-chair of the National Council. And this morning, as Nick mentioned, one of our priorities has been to update the Electoral Count Act of 1887. And I'm just going to speak for myself, but it predates me. You know, many lawmakers, including our guest today, hope to see that achieved in the coming days, and we'll look forward to hearing about that as well. One of the architects of the Senate version of the bill is United States Senator Joe Manchin from one of my favorite states, wild, wonderful West Virginia. You can tell it's my favorite because I actually know their motto. Prior to his current role as United States Senator, Senator Manchin was governor, and before that, important to the work that we're doing today, he was Secretary of State of West Virginia. Please join me in welcoming him today to our discussion.
Thank you.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you all.
So our plan today is to really just have a conversation. I mean, we know that the Electoral Count Act is coming up, and that the House passed a version, the Senate version is the one that is moving forward. For those of us who are former members of the House, you know, there's a little resentment about that. We always know that in the Senate is where things get finalized and then come back over to the House. And so, well, you know, I didn't want to say go there to die, but it's really important because over in the Senate, Senator Manchin, you have been really, along with Senator Susan Collins, moving forward a bipartisan piece of legislation that has the likelihood of being signed into law. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you think are the most important components and where you think we go from here.
Well, first, let me just say thank you to all of you, and it's good to be here with so many friends I see and recognize, and to work with you all on this level. I have Natalie Tennant, my she's been a former Secretary of State of West Virginia, a great friend of mine. We come from the same part of the state of West Virginia, Little Marion County. But anyway, being a Secretary of State, how many here have been Secretary of States besides? Okay. And then all of you are very much concerned about the election and the credibility and all that's going on in the country today, and we were concerned about that. After the December 6th, that was not a visit. That was an insurrection. Now, I was there. Now, me being the person I am, I thought they came in to visit. I really did. I heard all this noise out in the hall, and I'm thinking, well, you know, just open the doors, let them in. We'll talk. We can talk this through. And then by that time, the SWAT team comes in, and when they came in and took us out, you know, it was serious. We didn't know how serious it was as senators until we got down in the secured room and saw the monitors. To go through that and think about that, and I'm thinking, and we were all stunned down there. All these monitors were showing people coming through, breaking windows, trying to look and destroy people. You know, so anybody that says that did not happen is truly a denier of reality. And whether Democrats, Republicans, no matter what they are, and that's what we've got to tamp out, basically, and that is by the security of the election process. That's how serious we know this is. So I know that the former Congress, those of you in Congress think, well, things come to the Senate to die. The Senate still has thank God, we have the filibuster. The filibuster is designed for one reason only, to put a check and balance on the executive branch of government. Without the filibuster in the Senate, you don't have three equal branches of government. It doesn't happen. Because I can assure you, I've been there when it's been all Democrats, President, House, and Senate. And I've been there when it's been all Republicans, President, House, and Senate. A strong president, basically from one party, with both parties in the House and the Senate, can push things through, and they can't fight back because of the politics. But with that 60-vote rule, it says, whoa, wait a minute. We got to bring this country together a little bit. This is wrong. We just can't go down. You know, the House and Washington was so right. He said, the House is going to give you a hot cup of tea. We know that because it's all partisan. We expect that. They won. That's the people's voice. Boom. Now, how do we bring it together? The thought process and the genius of our founding fathers is unbelievable. We're holding on by a thread, by a very, very thin thread of democracy. And I say that because I'm concerned. And I saw, because these issues are so personal to people, the election reforms, okay? You know, and we were led to believe that, my goodness, we're going to repress people from going to vote. I don't think that can happen in this country. I think that is something so personal. That's mine. I own that. I own that vote. Nobody else can do anything with it but me. I'm the only one that can use it.
So how does the Electoral Count Act form the foundation?
Well, first of all, we didn't know that, we go clear back in history in the 1800s, and it was never, ever clarified. And basically the ceremonial role, which was intended, was never accurately displayed. We did that. It's totally ceremonial with this bill. Now, there were people on that committee, when we formed the committee, myself and Susan, we said, let's see if we can bring this together, Susan. It's got to be done. We can't go through this again. So she said, fine. So we had people that really wanted an awful lot more. They wanted to go much further. But then we thought, being a former governor, I said, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution says states' rights. So the states have rights that we had to protect also. And they're responsible for their election process. But they have to put guardrails on. So the guardrail was, whatever you all do, and I'll tell you a couple of the important things we did. First of all, make it strictly ceremonial. The vice president, whoever he or she may be, strictly is a ceremonial role reading the outcome of the votes that have been certified. Then we had to make sure, okay, how do we make sure this is certified? One of the most important things we did in this whole thing was, there's two things that we came to agreement, total agreement on, was first of all, you have to have an elected election officer, elected by the people, statewide. So we made sure that. They can't be appointed, someone who certifies the votes. So in some state constitution, it's the Secretary of State. Most states, it's going to be the governor. But they're going to be held accountable. When they certify those votes, they're accountable to that. So we had to hold someone accountable. And then basically the electoral, who's going to be, they have to be before the election, before an election and certified. So it can't be someone after election, well, I'm going to appoint these people, so they'll give me the count I want. We took that out of the equation. And then
It's interesting because in some states, obviously, for example, the Secretary of State certifies the election. Does that mean that that in those states, they will have to clarify then that it's an elected person who certifies? I mean, like Maryland, for example, has an appointed Secretary of State.
When this bill passes, you will have to have a statewide elected official, and it'll probably be the governor if your Constitution doesn't, okay? If the governor or the legislature says, no, I want the Secretary of State to be the election officer, you will have to have a statewide elected official that'll be certifying that your vote.
And what are some of the other elements that you think
The one big thing we had, the way it is right now, and I wasn't, I sat through that. I was there on the 6th. I went over to the House, and that was the first time I really participated. It's all been ceremonial, and it wasn't mandatory, but I wanted to go see the process. So I went over to the House. I'm sitting there, and I knew as soon as Arizona came, we were going to have someone jump up. One congressperson can jump up, and then it's asked from the chair, is there any senator that basically supports this position? And then, I don't need to name the names of the senators, but the same ones keep jumping up. Sure, we're against it too. So then they said, okay, well, we halt the vote. We halt the procedure of reading the votes. We go back to our respective sides. So we went over about 11, and by the time everything about 12, 12:30, we go back over to the Senate side. That's when all hell broke loose, about 1:30. James Langford was speaking that because there was about 7 or 8, and I knew that it was politically driven, the way the functions we have. And these are all good people, and they're all good friends of mine. And so James was getting ready to speak, and just speaking when, man, the beating on the door, and that's when everything changed. Then we go down, and I went over to each one of the Republicans, my friends, and I said, come on, we're better than this. Okay, enough of the politics, we're better than this. Let's rise above it. And most of them came back upstairs and changed, except for a few, their position. But with that, so what we did is this, with 20%. So it's going to take 20% of 435. That's what, 80, 86, 87 Congress people that have to say, it takes a little bit of work. So listen, my state got wronged, and I can prove to you it was wrong. That's fine. You have that right. But you better have 85 or 86 other people that says, yeah, I agree with you. Or no, it's not. And then if it does come from the House, you got to have 20 senators rather than just one. That's a heavy lift.
That's a big burden, right?
So that we think will deter this from happening, but you know, you've got to be vigilant, very vigilant.
And so, I mean, I guess I'm thinking just in terms of how we got to where we are. I mean, obviously the events of January 6th triggered that, but how do we get from there to having something that hopefully is going, I'm crossing my fingers, is going to be on the floor shortly?
Well, we're going to, our bill's ready, and I think you're talking to Amy later. So Amy Klobuchar, who's chair of the rules, Roy Blunt are both just top-notch people. They, you know, it should have, we did it from a committee, but the committee we did it from was a bipartisan committee that had to go through a jurisdictional committee, which is the Rules Committee. And Amy and Roy took it and ran with it, made a few tweaks and this and that, till we all came to agreement. We have a good bill. We're waiting for that procedure. And I've got to be honest with you, I would think the omnibus bill is the place to put it. But it needs to be done, and we all know it needs to be done now, why we have the vote and support to do it. There's people on the Democrat side that want to go a lot further, but they're not going to. And there's people on the Republican side that don't believe it's needed at all, and they're not going to prevail.
Well, clearly, if it comes out of the Senate and goes back to the House is going to pass this thing.
The way we have this set up right now, as of after January change of Congress, that might be a different story. So we all know the urgency of what we have to do.
Well, switching gears just a little bit, because part of what you laid out as the process, how we got to where we are, raises a question overall, and the council, I think, demonstrates that the possibility of working in a bipartisan fashion to do things that are important to the American people. Where do you think this goes next?
Well, here's the thing. You all sit here, and you got Democrats and Republicans, all with the same goal, and the same is protect the integrity of the elections, orderly transfer of power. You lose that, you've lost democracy, you lost the country. If the voters, the majority of voters in America do not believe that that's a certified election, that's an honest and fair election, if basically the deniers who believe the only good election, the only fair election is the one I win, or the one someone I support wins, we're in trouble. If that becomes a majority, I don't care who you are, where you're from, or what you believe, that's a problem, and that's who we are. Two things we have that most countries don't: orderly transfer of power and rule of law. You lose either one of those, and they're contested, then you lose America as we know it. And we've been tested. I remember the 1968s, those of us old enough to remember 1968, we never thought our country could survive. We watched it being burnt. We watched the Chicago National Convention of the Democratic Party fall apart. We watched it all come crumbling down. We watched John Kennedy get assassinated in '63. We watched Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy get assassinated in '68. How could we assassinate our leaders and be a country that's going to be a model of the world? We were in trouble, but we came through it. So I'll give you a little thing. When we had a shutdown in 2013, and Ted Cruz, and it was pretty hot and heavy in the Senate at that time. And I'd been there for 3 years. I'm thinking, oh man, I didn't act this way in West Virginia, and we didn't understand how this divisiveness could even happen at this level. So we're all in the ceremonial room of the old Senate chambers, and they take us in there every night. When they take us in there, it's serious. Because there's no staff at all. No staff, no guards, no nothing. They lock that door, we go in. And we're all sitting there, and it's hot, man, going back and forth, and people are accusing this and that. When you shut it down, you're putting all these people in hardship and harm's way, and on and on and on. All of a sudden, Lindsey Graham says, listen, guys, listen. He says, the last time I sat in this seat from South Carolina, he said, we had a civil war. We haven't gone that bad. We're not that bad yet. We're okay. We'll make it. And kind of put things, kind of cooled it down, calmed it, and we start talking to each other rather than through each other. We can get by it. But what I'm concerned about is if it wasn't for people like you willing to say, this is bigger than us. It's bigger than Democrat and Republican Party. This country is bigger than the political system that we have. We've got to understand that. And there's only one party, which is the American Party. Friends on both sides, Democrat and Republicans, have different views of how to solve a problem. And that's what we should be doing. The problem today is we can't even agree what the problem is until we can blame somebody. So the problems are identified. Can I blame Democrats more than Republicans? Can we get a better leg up on this one, or vice versa? That's what that irks the living daylights out of me about the party system today. It is not designed to solve the problems that America needs to be solved. They're designed right now because we are basically, truly, we are supporting so much bad behavior. We're rewarding bad behavior. The worst outrageous things they do and say, more money comes in because the country is split. Donald Trump was the one that took advantage of the process that we had. It's not his fault that we are the country we are. It's his fault that he was able to capitalize it and drive it further apart. We can't have that happen, whether it's a Donald Trump of the world or anyone else. You just can't. And I know him and worked with him the best I possibly could. A lot of good ideas I appreciate and support it, but the way and process. But when it came to basically putting the country before oneself or party, he could not rise above that. That's about as simple as I can make it. And I have Democrats in the same procedure, in the same position. So we've got to fight against that ever happening. And we're at a crossroads. The 2024 election is going to be, it's going to be monumental in where we go as a nation and how we survive it. I am so proud of the 2022 elections. You have not heard, except from maybe one little area, another state with an A by its name, the same state that we had, that makes a little bit of friction going on. That'll be cured. But nothing to what we thought could have happened. Nothing to what we thought could have happened. So whatever you all have done, and basically bringing it to a fruition, it's truly made a difference, and you ought to be proud of that.
So you
really
raise you raise an important
Very proud.
question. Thank you. You do raise an important question and point, and it is this: that democracy survived the 2022 election, but looking ahead, what's the next step? Because I don't think we're out of the woods. I mean, you've said that. We're not out of the woods, but we survived. So after the Electoral Count Act, it goes into effect, 2024 comes around. What's next? What else do we need to do to shore up democracy?
Well, we need to participate. They told me that we were going to restrain by not making the changes that was wanting from the Democrat side, the further left side of the Democratic Party, and make all these drastic changes to election laws and make them federal and basically take the states out of the equation. There's more people voting today than ever before. There's more people voting in Georgia who they thought suppressed the vote, and they were telling us about all the suppression. You are not going to deny the American people the right to vote. So from that standpoint, we have to protect it, but also you have to acknowledge the states' rights. And when you hold people accountable, elected officials, this madness can only last so long. You follow me? Because people are saying enough is enough. Enough is enough. You're not fixing the problems of America. And I tell people this all the time. I tell people when I go to fundraisers and I said, listen, I don't think you should give one penny, not give one contribution or one donation to a politician. You ought to look at a politician, make an investment. I'm talking to all these people who've been very well blessed in life and have done well politically and done well basically financially. And I says, you don't make these types of decisions when you're investing. You expect a return. You have made the absolute worst investment in the political process in America that I've ever seen smart people make. If you made these same decisions in your private sector, you'd be bankrupt. You would be bankrupt making crazy decisions because you're not demanding anything. So why don't you tell a politician, if I come up to you and says, I would sure hope you support my campaign. I need a contribution. Well, I'm sorry, I don't give contributions to politicians. I'm willing to make an investment. Tell me what I should expect as a return. What can I expect from you as a return on good government if I make that investment? Tell me that. If they can't give you an answer, you better move on to the next candidate. That's what, the more we educate the voters, and they're more educated than ever before, and they're very much involved. When I knew this election, I'll tell you what, Jerry Moran, a good friend of mine from Kansas, remember when the Kansas took the vote on abortion? And in Kansas, deep red Kansas, and the abortion issue popped up the way it did? Jerry came back, and we were talking. He said, Jesus, Joe, he said, you won't believe what happened in Kansas. I said, what? He said, I'm scared to die. I don't know why. I said, Jerry, you got to take a position, do what's in your heart. That was an undertow. That one rised. That showed its face in Kansas way back when, and it was right there on election day, because it basically the families of women and the women of America kind of rose up.
But you do think that there are structural things that we can support. I mean, I was talking with Senator Landrieu earlier about people standing in long lines to vote. I mean, you know, who should have to stand in line for 2, 4, 6 hours to vote? And are there things that we
Well,
can
we
do?
have early voting. I mean, early voting is pretty much accepted in most states, I think, today.
But
to some
folks
extent.
are still standing in long lines, and to me, sometimes that might be a question of, you know, not bad behavior or nefarious behavior, but maybe a question of resources, maybe locating more, identifying more polling stations, maybe the federal government supporting those secretaries of state out there so that they have, you know, more to conduct
that's
elections.
the state. For us federally to come in and say this and that, let me tell you, I've been through the process for many, many years, and they're saying, well, you couldn't even give water to a person. You couldn't do this. I remember the day when people were standing in lines. Yeah, you gave them that, but you gave them also a list of what you know. So there was a reason for that. Now, you have certified poll workers that should be able to make sure they're comfortable, get water, get whatever necessity. But the average person coming off the streets and hear this, I'll guarantee you one thing, they're giving them more than that. That's usually the way it worked before. And that's what we were trying to prevent from ever going back to that procedure. But with that, yes, drop boxes, we don't have in West Virginia, you know, but we have early voting. I started when I was Secretary of State. Natalie basically expanded. We did all we could, because we wanted to make it convenient. We had people work shift work, worked in the mine, you know, and they just didn't have, on Tuesdays, they might be working a 12-hour shift, not have a chance to vote. So we made acceptance for all of that, and it worked tremendously. And I think most states are, but the people will demand the right to give us, and they're going to hold election officers responsible. That's what you have to do, but it's a very delicate thing. But the voting that we do in America and the way we count and certify is better than anywhere in the world, and we should continue that. Now, you know, I've never been of mail-in voting. I just, my head, can't wrap my head around it. But it has worked. Oregon has done it for a long time. Other states have done it. It's more and more accepted. The drop boxes in areas of very high concentration, that has been very carefully monitored. My goodness, they had armed guards watching it this time. Still worked. So I mean, the will of the people is just something. It's just unbelievable. Democracy is a very fragile thing. And we're still in the experimental stages, to be honest with you. But with that, the rest of the world is watching.
So I know that there are a couple of questions out there, and we're running out of time. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand. I think a microphone will find its way to you. Here we have.
On anything.
You can ask him anything.
Anything.
Who am I to get in the way of what you can ask the senator? Go ahead.
Joe, I love you. I think you're a national hero. I think you put your country and your district before your party. Having said that, do you think the Senate, House should have, it should take 261 votes to pass something in the House? No, I don't think you do. That would be the filibuster in the House. I asked one of your colleagues from the House, this is my question. I asked one of your colleagues who was a House member in the Senate, what do you like? Did you like being in the Senate? He said, I love it. I can kill anything. And the bottom line was the filibuster. How the hell do we get anything done with the filibuster? The only way is through the omnibus, which doesn't require the filibuster. So I just am stunned that people think we should keep the filibuster.
Well, the filibuster should, I mean, there's ways to change the filibuster, but at the end of the day, you should have still a majority of 60 votes. But the way to change it should be a talking filibuster. We have to basically, you know, right now, I can stop something just by having my assistant call down and says, we're blocking it, which is crazy. It's crazy. I should have to go to the floor and have support of at least 5 members, 5% of the Senate, that supports my position of why I'm filibustering and my position and my cure. For me, I've said this, the political process only works is if we have a disagreement, I might have an idea of how I can help our disagreement. That's the cure. If I'm not required to give you a cure or a rational reason why I'm against something, then the public doesn't really know. They have no idea. We've got to make it more transparent. I've been trying to change all that. I have been trying to change it. I just will not get rid of it. I know that it's not for blocking. It's basically for uniting, bringing people together to have a bipartisan support to where you have public. So Democrats, if it's 50 Republicans and 10 Democrats, then the Democrats have to support a Republican position that was a majority Republicans because they were able to adjust it, make some changes. Right now, it's been used strictly what you just described, absolutely, as a blocking, killing machine. And it was not designed that way. We can change it if I've got to get on the floor and talk to give all the American people my reason why I am filibustering this person or this piece of legislation or an amendment or whatever. And I have to have support from my colleagues to do that. That basically should be the way the filibuster should be working. We've been talking about that when the voting laws were such a heightened after the January 6th. But they kept trying to tell me, he said, well, you know, we go back to the talking filibuster. I said, I like the talking filibuster. They said, but when you get done talking, you sit down, you relinquish that, and we go to a vote. I went back from 1789 to present. I could never find a time in the history of this country that basically it didn't take a supermajority. One, you can never stop a senator from speaking. Now, once a person stops speaking, it still takes a majority to move to the bill, supermajority, you know, or unanimous consent. So that's the same thing. They were trying to say, well, once you stop speaking, then it's time to vote. Not unless you get unanimous consent to do so. And that's the beauty of the Senate, was really designed unbelievably to try to bring us together. But it's been used to separate us. And I understand. And that's a lot of the congressmen come over can't understand, you know, they're amazed at how this process works because you don't participate. You got 218, your balls to the wall. You just shove it down the throat. We understand that. You give us something and say, geez, that's a pretty good idea, but man, there's some crazy stuff in there. We got to clean this up. But then I got to get 10 people on the other side to think the same as we do. It's a tough one.
So
we can fix it, though.
So we're going to take one more question because I know your hand was up, and then we're going to close it out.
All right, Tim Romer from Indiana. Great to see you, Senator, and thank you so much for your time this morning and the great work you're doing on Electoral Count Reform Act. I agree with what you said about great things happened in the election in 2022. Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, deniers were denied. The American people won that election, not Democrats or Republicans.
Democracy won.
We won, right? Democracy won. That's a great outcome for our group, a great outcome for West Virginians and Hoosiers and everybody else. But we're not out of the woods. We want to keep working with you and people in the Senate on things like money for infrastructure for elections, cybersecurity issues, those kinds of things to protect us from China and Russia. We know they're going to try to upset our elections. And our poll workers. They're our neighbors. They're getting attacked. They're getting vilified. Their families are getting attacked. We want to protect our neighbors. So on these kinds of issues moving forward to 2024 and so forth, what advice do you have for working with your great office, with Wes, with Lance, with others? How do we work with you? How do we work with Republicans in the Senate?
One thing I thought we were going to get on that was it'd be a federal offense, a federal felony basically to attack any poll worker in any state, in any election. It's a federal offense. And I think we have to do that. We're going to have to rise to the occasion. The penalty is going to be matched to the severity of the crime, and basically attacking or intimidating a poll worker is a very severe crime for democracy. So we should look at it from that standpoint. I think that we can get some of that. There's a lot that we were talking about that we just couldn't get over that hump, and that's where you all can basically show us the support of the American public of how we can do it. I really believe. And we can give you all of the things that we had to drop out of the bill because we just didn't have the support or was able to build that support for it. That's where you all, as Democrats and Republicans, working together. Here's the thing, basically what you're doing, you're bringing the country together, and that's what you're trying to hold it together. You got to continue to do that. You just can't think, well, we've won this one or this is better than, it's better than what we had, but could it be better than what we got? Yeah. And that's how you have to look at everything. We don't make there's no perfect bill. We haven't, I've been there 13 years. We have not passed a perfect piece of legislation since I've been there. We've passed better pieces. We've made them a little bit better. We've made some a lot worse. And you got to continue. It's a continuous work and struggle. The only thing I can tell you is that I'm concerned from the standpoint that the party system, as we know it, unless the grand old party takes back the grand old positions it's always had, we're going to be in trouble. The Democratic Party, who always supposed to be right there and trying to the balance of and the working people and what they better get back into their roots of who they are and what their purpose is. And both of them have gone to their respective corners. And the people are looking for some, wait a minute, we want some unity here. Who's going to bring us, how can we bring people back together and give them the confidence that we're going to support that? So this 2024 election is going to be a breaking point. 2022 set up the stage for a tremendous transformation of 2024, I believe. These next 2 years and the whole election process we're going through, which is starting extremely early, is going to have a lot of interaction. We rejected that in 2022 election, and we're not sure as hell not going back to it in 2024. So I think that basically the candidates, there'll be candidates rise up. I've always said this, it's about the country. It's not about the person, it's not about the party. It's about the country. If my country does well, my state will do well. No matter who the president is, you should be praying for your president every day. I don't care who it is, whether it's Donald Trump as president, whether it's Joe Biden as president. You should pray every day that that president succeeds. And if we're in a position as lawmakers, we should work our butts off making them successful. But don't be afraid to speak truth to power. When you're sitting in the Oval Office and it's just you and the president, and they grab you by the arm and they said, your country needs you, then what you have to be able to say, if in a respectful way, Mr. President, the country needs you too. It needs both of us. And be able to say that and then give constructive criticism in a respectful way. Have you thought about this? Could you try this? Can we sit down and talk about it? Put me in touch with somebody. You do that in a respectful way, but you walk out of that Oval Office and you can't wait to get to the microphone to just blast the living crap. You've got nothing. You've got nothing to offer. You really don't. And it just makes me sick that everyone runs and basically, I don't have a person out of 99 other senators that I don't consider my friend. I will not campaign against a sitting colleague. I will not give a penny, no matter who's running against a Republican or a Democrat, whether I like them or don't, whether I get along or not. I think they're all my friends, they're my colleagues. Whoever you send me from your state, I'm going to do everything I can to befriend them and work with them. That's my responsibility. You've already made your choice. I make mine to work with them. And that's what we have to do. And you can't accept this other stuff. You just can't. So it's so refreshing to see you all come together and continue to keep pushing your issue one, but also, how do we save it? You save it through the polling place. If we don't have an orderly transfer of power and there's no confidence in the voting process, and the voting process is not secured and certified, we got nothing. And we got nothing to go around the world and say, guys, here's how you do it. So with that, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator Manchin. You've given us a lot to chew on this afternoon. We are going to be sitting together as a council, really strategizing about the things that are on that to-do list.
Sammy coming in, she through the Rules Committee. It's going to be very helpful with that too. And we're all working together, but they do a great job.
Well,
we're going to miss her well.
excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you again. Time is way up. But we really appreciate your time this morning, and I want to welcome to the stage my colleague, Representative Barbara Comstock of Virginia, who's going to take it over from now. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Senator Manchin. As Senator Manchin said, we are so proud of the 2022 election and the work that the National Council did on that. And I'm so proud to work with my co-chairs, Donna Edwards and Zach Wamp and Tim Romer of the council in doing this good work. And I'm also honored to be introducing our next guest who has been So wonderful. Where has he gone now? Oh, here you are. And doing so much work in making sure that we have elections with integrity. Ben Ginsberg is somebody who anyone who has worked on elections on either side knows. I have been fortunate to work with Ben Ginsberg on elections instead of being on the opposing side, both whether opposing as a Republican or as a Democrat. So fortunately, I've been able to always be with him on elections. But he has worked with 4 presidents. And I knew of him even before I got to work with him on the 2000 campaign, which at that time we thought was a raucous campaign and a close campaign. We thought we had seen it all in the 2000 campaign, but of course, in the 2020 campaign was something quite else. But he is a preeminent election law attorney, and he also worked with Governor Romney, where I was proud to work with him both in the 2008 and the 2012 elections. And then in 2020, when we saw so much misinformation, Ben really came to the forefront and worked with so many election attorneys and so many constitutional scholars and looking at all the misinformation and just knocking it down and doing so much scholarly work and making sure that people understood how much disinformation was out there. So I am so honored to bring Ben to the stage and to address us today. So thank you so much, Ben, for being with us today.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here with you, and for all the work that you all have done in these past elections to indeed make a potentially really bad situation really much better. Let me give you my perspective on the 2022 election, but really as some things to look at moving forward. 3 things we should double down on, 3 things we should rethink and move forward on. And my perspective on this is as somebody who practiced with Barbara and other Republicans and opposed Democrats. But that experience was 4 decades doing election day operations for Republicans, looking at the polls really carefully to see if the elections were done right and if there was fraud. Truth is, we never found that fraud, and so the basic premise of Donald Trump's charges about the election, I knew to be false from that experience. So that's my starting point in all this. As for the 2022 elections, I think it's fair to say, and I certainly agree with what other folks have said here, that the fever broke in 2022, but the virus is still out there in the body politic, and there are some nasty mutations that are capable of happening. So we have to continue to be vigilant. While election denier candidates who were not incumbents all lost, there was not an incumbent who embraced election denialism who lost. And so that fever does still sort of exist, even if it's more dormant. And the red states, where a lot of the election denialism started, are still red states, very red states. So with that, let me get to the 3 double downs and 3 rethinks. First of all, let me completely endorse what Senator Manchin said and is doing in the Senate. Got to have ECA reform. Issue 1 has been terrific in moving that forward, and that's really important to do. But as you heard, it seems to be pretty much on the right track. Secondly, the democracy held. And the people who really deserve a tremendous amount of credit, really in some ways all the credit, are the election administrators who were in the polls. It's great that a bunch of you are here today, but you all really deserve tremendous praise and the additional protections that were just mentioned. That challenge is going to be there in 2024 as well. And what was true from 2022 is that election administrators adopted some new programs after the 2020 election that really helped a great deal. So the double down is to collect and share the best practices that were put in place in various jurisdictions to deal with the problem this time, and to be sure, get more funding for elections so that things can be any better for that, and the protections need to be done. Number 3 is we had really good election results, but we're not out of the woods yet. And while election deniers failed to win any of the positions overseeing elections in any states, we're still a really divided nation, and we should recognize that. Again, the election was not a knockout of election denialism, because there are still many people who embraced election denialism who were in office. So even if election denialism didn't work in the general election, remember that it did work as a primary strategy for Republicans. And so in order to deal with all of that, I think it's really important to double down on a sort of sustained communications strategy and political organization project to show, number one, election denialism is not a winning strategy electorally, and we cannot hammer home that point enough. Number 2, take advantage of the fact and take at face value the Republican claim of a massive 50,000 poll worker army. They were out there in the polls. The reality is they found nothing wrong. They didn't find any fraud. They didn't find irregularities out of the normal. It's important to take them at their word, recognize that they were able to put everyone they wanted in the polls and found nothing. Next, there's no proof of any fraud developed by any of the state election police that were put in place in a number of states. And that failure by the state election police to find the systemic fraud that they thought was going to be there is an important point to hammer home as well. And more broadly, we need to come up with the message, the messengers, the platforms for getting that word out to the 30% of the population that appears to still believe that our elections aren't accurate. So what I think we need to do on that point is to rethink a bit the strategy of dealing with election deniers. The strategy so far has been to not engage with them. Don't give them the bandwidth and the air to be able to get their views out. I think it is worth re-examining, directly confronting election deniers with what they're saying in order to try and talk to elements of that 30% who may be persuadable in the light of the election results and the lack of evidence that this is not a helpful and healthy thing for our democracy. And let me put in a plug for doing that very much on the local level as opposed to nationally. The national environment is pretty poisonous. What we're finding is that if you go into local communities, there are people in local communities who want their communities to function properly and not be filled with violence and the venom from election denial. So it's really important to go in at the county level and develop advocates for real elections. Next, a little bit of a double down on the state legislative front. There are still a number of states that may try some of the election bills that were tried. The double down part is to really pay attention to the elements of those bills that have to be stopped, that really are election subversion, taking the responsibility for elections away from professionals and giving it to politicians, criminalizing what poll workers do on a regular basis, weaponizing poll watchers. That's the stuff that you really need to concentrate on in state elections rather than, in all honesty, the number of early voting days. And lastly, let me say that we should do a rethink on something really fundamental. we've all defended our election system. And in the face of any evidence that it doesn't work, it does work. But honestly, if you're an election administrator, or you've been a candidate, or you're a lawyer representing candidates, you know that our election system is not a precision mechanism. That in fact, it's sort of a hodgepodge that's grown up over the years. There are 10,000 jurisdictions. If you have 10,000 separate jurisdictions responsible for the casting and counting of votes, you will not get consistency, and that lack of consistency is sort of a ticking time bomb. So the election system has kind of sprung up without planning, and is really now a hodgepodge. It is worthwhile to go back and think as a matter of institutional design how you would develop an election system to get greater uniformity, greater fairness for voters. So with that, that is my sort of 6 points. Thank you very much for having me, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer a couple questions. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Miles Parks with NPR. Could you just drill down on the point you just made at the end there about uniformity? Would you be in favor of some sort of federalizing of the elections, or how would you see instituting that uniformity then?
I think you have to do it within the principles of federalism. When I had the honor of being co-chair of a presidential commission on election administration with my Democratic colleague Bob Bauer, we were the only political hacks on that commission. The rest were all professional election administrators, and we talked to many, including folks in this room. The overriding message we got is one size does not fit all. And that is true among different states that are very different, and it's true among jurisdictions in states. Urban areas do not have the same issues as rural areas. But there is a way to consolidate. There is a way to have the same quality of voting machines in every jurisdiction. There are better ways to make sure that voter rolls are kept, so that becomes accurate. And now it really is too much of a 10,000 jurisdictions all doing their own thing. Some states are better than others.
For securing democracy. I appreciated the points you raised. You touched on the need for greater engagement with election denialism. I know there's been a certain amount written about a Tarrant County election administrator, Hyder Garcia, right, and his approach to welcoming in election deniers, something that seems to potentially be getting more traction in Texas. Right? But there are also concerns with that approach in terms of the resources involved, the threats that he's had to deal with. Can you sort of talk a little bit more about what kind of engagement you're sort of hoping to have, right? And what safeguards can be in place to, on the one hand, try and get people more confident, while at the same time making sure that those who are continuing to receive threats aren't just inviting more of that hostility going forward?
Sure, it's a great question. Look, I think that there were folks, Steve Reicher and Al Schmidt and many others, who this cycle were more transparent. I'll give you an example of one. There's a group that I co-chair with Bob Bauer called the Election Officials Legal Defense Network. And we want to implement a Pillars of the Community program, which means we go into individual counties that are particularly hotbeds of election denialism, get across the ideological spectrum and community spectrum, leaders of business and the faith communities and civic organizations and educators, all along the political spectrum, to sit down and meet with the election administrator for that jurisdiction well in advance to describe all the safeguards involved. And this should be done well in advance so it's not in the more heated atmosphere right before the elections. And in bringing all those people together, let the election administrators explain all the safeguards so that those pillars of the community are then advocates for the soundness of the election system. And if, in fact, there is a problem after the election, it's a tight election, there are charges made, the goal is for them to be able to say, I've kicked the tires on our election administration, it works, it's going to give you valid results, I don't know who's going to, we're not asking them to do anything partisan in any way, but just to validate the integrity of their local systems.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, but if we don't move forward, then Senator Klobuchar gets here, we're not going to have time to put her on stage. So excuse me, Mr. Ginsberg.
No, no problem. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. And I want to welcome my colleague, Zach Wamp. Next up, we will have a panel with Zach that will assess implications of the recent midterms while they're making their way forward. And while I guess we already have our chairs up here, let me tell you that my fellow NCI co-chair, former Congressman Zach Wamp, will moderate this discussion, and he is also co-chairs of the Reformers Caucus, which you'll hear more about later this morning. And before that, he served the state of Tennessee in Congress. So thank you. And we also have, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have the rest. Sarah Longwell here and
Jessica Taylor.
Jessica Taylor. So thank you.
And Eric
Great to see you,
Erickson is our third panelist, may walk in the middle of this.
Okay.
He left Delta Atlanta Airport early this morning, but sat on the tarmac for over an hour. So delayed, but he might walk in the middle of it. And if he doesn't make this panel, we may actually stick him in at lunch. Let me just say good morning to you all. I'm a Southern Baptist, so I'm keenly aware that the coffee is starting to affect your physical body. And so hopefully we'll have a break very soon, but just kind of bear with us. Kind of a point of personal privilege, I want to say Mike Peabody is in the house. Mike, how old are you now? 90, how old? 90? 94 years old. Whitney Hatch, our chairman of Issue 1, is here, and Nick recognized him earlier this morning, but Mike Peabody at 94 has done an awful lot. The Reformers Caucus of Issue 1 wouldn't exist without Mike. And Mike, every time I see you, I want to recognize you as long as you shall live, young man. You're a good man, and I'm grateful for you, and thanks for all you've done. Another point of personal privilege, the host of Swamp Stories and Truth Tellers, the Issue 1 podcast. My son Weston happens to be here. He's the new mayor back home from Chattanooga and Hamilton County. So he's got another event at 11:30 here in this building with Senator Corker and Congressman Fleischman and his Deputy Mayor Corey Guerin, but I'm honored that he's here as well. I could go through here and say people like Jane Harmon have meant so much to our country, and we're all collectively here, but I also want to just echo our gratitude for each of you and what you've done to help protect our democratic republic here at a time of perilous danger. And yes, we've come through some difficult days, but we also have just as many challenges in front of us as we had behind us. I think it is a constant challenge. Reed Ribble, who's from Tennessee now, a former member from Wisconsin, said to me 2 days ago on a phone call in advance of this meeting, remind everyone that we don't have an election integrity problem in America. We actually conduct elections as cleanly, effectively, safely, and securely as anybody in the world. What we have is a problem of certain people not accepting the results of free and fair elections unless those results suit their own personal desires. And that's the challenge that brings us together. And as I said last night, I got involved in this because of Article 1 in the Congress 6.5 years ago. But when the election denier situation started raising up as an issue, surfacing, I'm really grateful that Issue 1, the National Council, all the different groups focused on it, because this is where this experiment in self-government known as the American Republic really does become an experiment. And without our diligence and our faithfulness to our country first, it might not last. So our three panelists here are from very different walks of life, but they're all sort of bringing the same input to us today. Jessica Taylor here to my right is actually from Elizabethton, Tennessee, really proud of that. She is the governor and senator's chief person for the Cook Political Report, which we all rely on for probably the best assessment of where we are in American politics from time to time. I think polling has gone south in a lot of ways, so you have to rely on these experts to tell you actually what's going on. And then Sarah Longwell over here is the publisher of The Bulwark and the founder of Defending Democracy, and they each have unique perspectives. Eric Erickson is a personal friend of mine. Some of y'all might not like him because he's sort of a conservative icon, but he is a Reagan Republican like myself, and he's been telling the truth about elections and January 6th and other challenges we face, and so he's also part of this program. But we're going to start today with a few questions, and I'm going to start here and analyze from a midterm perspective some of what you heard about in the last few minutes, but from experts on really what they think happened. I follow this stuff closely, probably more than my wife would care from day to day. And, you know, I'm interested in like 4 different things I've heard contributed to the surprise of this past midterm election. And 4 of those things, kind of at the top of the list in my part of the world, is Trump fatigue. Not necessarily we don't like Trump anymore, but we're just sort of tired of this. We're just sort of worn out. So Trump fatigue is a factor. I think abortion may have been a factor. I'm interested in people's perspective on how much of a factor it may have been in certain pockets of the country and the Supreme Court rulings. Candidate quality, candidate strength. Mitch McConnell uttered those words and it sort of reverberated across the country. That was an issue. And then the election denierism. Clearly, Eric Erickson sent me some notes this morning and said if you can't show up, point out that like Masters and Lake in Arizona underperformed grossly other Republicans on the ballot in Arizona, which tells me that there was an election denierism kickback because the issues weren't different for those candidates, but that's what separated them, or whether or not they were in the, I don't want to be ugly, but say kind of the crybaby category as opposed to, you know, the mature adult category in accepting American elections. So I'm very interested in both of your perspectives. Jessica, we'll start with you on the red wave, why did it not happen, what did happen, and dissect it as best you can.
Sure. So this was very much a unique election, especially for us as handicappers, because we came into this, you look at the historical precedence that is there, and we should have seen big Republican gains, especially, I think, you know, maybe not big gains in the Senate, but the fact that Republicans only had to flip 1 seat, and they had at least 3 Democratic incumbents in states that Biden won by less than 3 points that were particularly vulnerable. And in fact, everything that could go right for Democrats in the Senate did, up and down the ballot. In fact, I think they're in a decent chance to actually gain a seat, which we did not see coming here if, you know, less than a week now, depending upon what happens in Georgia. And you mentioned the Arizona results where you had both Blake Masters and Kari Lake underperform. Well, you had Georgia sort of proved to be Trump's kryptonite in a way, because he attacked Brian Kemp, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, for not bending to his will in 2020 and not certifying the election. Well, they sort of had the last laugh. They won their primaries, Kemp by more than 50 points over David Perdue, and all of them went on to win outright. But you have Herschel Walker, who has a lot of personal baggage as well, but is the Trumpiest candidate that there is, and has perpetuated the election lies, and he was behind and well below 50% when you had other candidates that were getting, you know, upwards of 53, 54%. To me, it came down to also candidate versus climate, and I think the climate improved enough for Democrats. You know, we saw it as a high when gas prices were going down, when the economy was looking better, when it was a couple of months after the Dobbs decision. We sort of saw that high watermark happen in August and in early September. It did seem to wane a little bit. And I mean, I was even talking with Democratic pollsters the week before the election that were just downright, you know, dismal, thinking that, you know, even if some of the races looked close, you typically see those undecided voters breaking against the incumbent in this type of an environment. But I think it really, to me, it came down a lot to candidate quality. And McConnell saw, others saw the warning lights there, but really, you know, with the NRSC not playing in there, with Senate Leadership Fund not really, you know, I don't think they fully did as much as they could to maybe stop some of these candidates. But the fact that they had to pour millions of dollars into Ohio, just underscores how much of a strange midterm this was, that they didn't have a candidate that was raising money hardly at all. And, you know, Pennsylvania was a good example there too. Of course, the only seat so far that has flipped at all and could be the only seat. Dr. Oz's numbers were just pitiful after the primary, and they never really improved. And even though we saw a tightening in those races, including John Fetterman's own internal polling the week before the election had him down to, ended up winning by 5. I think ultimately it came down to, you know, the old sort of adage, like, which candidate do you want to have a beer with? When you think back to the George W. Bush years. Well, if you're like hardcore blue-collar Pennsylvania, you'd probably rather have one with someone like John Fetterman than Dr. Oz, who came off as inauthentic and had just recently moved to the States. And I do think that abortion had an impact as well, I think more so in some of the governor's races. So look, for instance, in Wisconsin, where we had a split result, where Tony Evers was reelected, but then Ron Johnson was at the same time too. This was a state that had a trigger law that went back to the 1800s, that he was, you know, essentially said he would pardon or give clemency to any abortion doctors any doctor that performed an abortion. But then in Nevada, you did have another split result there with Catherine Cortez Masto winning. Her opponent, Adam Laxalt, who was sort of one of the more normal Republicans, I think he didn't have as much baggage as someone like, you know, Oz or Masters, but he had been an election denier. He worked in Nevada to overturn the election results. And then the Republican who ousted the sitting governor there too, the Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, he didn't make that a key issue. And also abortion is already codified into law in Nevada, so I think that didn't make it as much of a salient issue there too. So I think it was a combination of a lot of these things, at least when I'm looking at these Senate and governor's races.
That's a lot. It's fascinating too. Sarah, what's your angle?
So one of the things that I do is a ton of focus groups. In fact, there's people in this room who have been on my podcast called the Focus Group. And all I do is listen to voters all the time. We do them at least once a week, usually twice a week. We just did one in Georgia last night. And the thing that was so interesting, you know, if you went out a year ago, what you could see was just a total enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans could not wait to vote for any living, breathing Republican. The last election was stolen. Trump got a raw deal. I can't wait to go vote for people. And you just saw that with Youngkin in Virginia. That was like, they couldn't wait to do it. And I was saying to reporters, they're like, what's going on? And I'm like, man, you talk to Republicans and they can't wait to vote. You talk to Democrats and they're like, ugh, you know, Joe Biden's too progressive. Joe Biden's too moderate. Democrats can't get anything done. And I was just like, man, the differential in how people are feeling is huge. The big thing that I think abortion did is I think it evened out that enthusiasm gap, right? I don't think it was like, because I was talking to a lot of people beforehand who said, if abortion happens, it's just people in the streets, huge game changer. And I was like pretty skeptical of that, but I don't think it had no impact. And I also think it had like weird, different impacts in different places. Like it didn't have any impact in Texas, and you know Abbott's got a very strict abortion law. So it was uneven, but I do think it helped sort of even out that enthusiasm gap. And then it was a dogfight for independent voters, swing voters. So we did over the last 4 months, all we've been talking to are swing voters, and I kept saying, even as the polls tightened and everyone started being like red wave, red wave, red wave. I was like, man, I cannot find a swing voter that is going to vote for Doug Mastriano. Like, I haven't found one. I keep going to Pennsylvania. I keep talking to swing voters. Cannot find a one. And I go to people, you listen to these, and you sat in on some of these, you would listen to folks in Arizona, and they would be like, oh, Mark Kelly, oh, he's lame, whatever. And then they'd be like, but I'm not voting for Blake Masters. Did you know he likes the Unabomber? He's a lunatic. And when people talk about candidate quality, I want to be like as direct as possible. Like the words that people used in the focus groups, swing voters, and I'll define swing voters as people who voted for Trump in 2016 and they voted for Biden in 2020. They are institutionally Republican. Like they are right-leaning in the way that they orient themselves. But they were like, well, Carrie Lake is nuts. Like she's just an insane person.
And I want to tell you, like, I was the biggest, my group, one of my PAC was the biggest outside spender in that race. We put almost $4.5 million into that Lake race for persuasion, and people were ready. If you go back and you look, 11% of Republicans voted for Katie Hobbs. And no shade to Katie Hobbs, but she was not a bang-up candidate, right? But Kari Lake was terrible. And so the thing about abortion is it did turn it from a referendum on the party in power into a choice election. And I mean that in the double entendre way that I just said it, which it was in part about choice, and it became a choice. And so all of these Republican candidates, and so we ended up putting about $25 million in total to defeat election denialist candidates. In the primaries, we helped pro-democracy Republicans like Brad Raffensperger, because we were very focused on democracy. But what we saw, the opportunity we saw, was that these independent voters, after you evened out the enthusiasm gap, it was a dogfight for those swing voters. Democrats won that because of the poor candidate quality and the election denialism. Oh, the last thing I'll say is I keep being on the phone with reporters, and they keep trying to be like, so was it abortion or was it democracy? You can't tease those things out, because actually what happened, right, is there's a pretty strong overlap between somebody who is an election denialist and somebody who has pretty extreme views on abortion. Like the Republicans who did well tend to be, Ron DeSantis, who was like 15 weeks, they try to have these compromised positions. But, Tim Michaels, who was like, let's just go back to pre-Civil War rules on abortion, like that didn't fly. And so what voters were seeing was the extremism of the candidates, which had to do both with their election denialism and with abortion, although, and sorry, I promise this is the last thing I'll say, but when you would do the focus groups, you ask at the top all the time, how do you think things are going in the country? And everyone would be like, bad. Inflation, crime, and every poll that you read about leading up to the election that talked about crime, inflation, the economy as the dominant issues was right. That's what we heard from voters every time. And then you'd get deeper into the group and you'd start talking about vote choice. Who are you going to vote for, Mark Kelly or Blake Masters? Who are you going to vote for, Kari Lake or Katie Hobbs? Who are you going to vote for, Dr. Oz or John Fetterman? And they would say, oh, I'm voting for the Democrat because the Republican's crazy. And so, the polls weren't wrong in identifying that, but that is the role. Abortion played a big role in the vote. And when people would say they're crazy, they would often use abortion as the way in. They would know their position on abortion, but they would also kind of in the same breath be like, well, they're crazy on abortion and they won't believe that the election was, they think the election was stolen. And so it was all in there to create a picture of a candidate that was too extreme that they didn't want to vote for.
If I could add just one thing to what Sarah said, and I watched a lot of her groups, focus groups, they were really instrumental to us. Another thing that I picked up in some of those is they didn't want Trump to run again in 2024, and they don't want Biden to run again in 2024. Like that's their nightmare scenario is another 2020 election. And we looked. I was really tracking. Okay, how much can these Democratic candidates like Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock outperform Biden's approval ratings? Because in some of these swing states, it was much lower than nationally. Kind of climbed back up to the mid 40s, but in some of these states polls I was seeing beforehand, he was in 38, 39. To outrun that is just very hard to do. And my boss, Amy Walter, has written a lot about what she terms the meh voter. And it's voters that they don't like Biden right now. They're in sort of this, they're not in the strongly disagree camp because those are going to vote Republican, but they're in this like somewhat disagree, somewhat disapprove group. And ultimately those voters, when we're looking at the exit polls and data we're getting after this, they did vote Democratic. And I think it was because, as Sarah said, it became a choice election. It wasn't necessarily a choice on Biden, but because Trump had inserted himself into this election via candidates in his own way. We never seen a former president try to influence an election this way. Typically, they go, Jimmy Carter's building habitat houses, like they go and do something else, but he is so myopically focused on his belief, false belief, of course, the election was stolen, that it trickled down to these candidates. And I think it became a choice between, do you want sort of the Democrat or a more Trumpian Republican candidate? And those meh voters went Democrat, and I think that was key.
I am tempted to not say another word after listening to both of these ladies speak, just to let them rip and go, but I am going to kind of jump in here. My daughter's also the district attorney, so when I sit between my daughter and my wife, I usually try to be quiet and more reserved. I will say this on the candidate quality issue. I'm a Republican. I'm a Reagan Republican, and I'm going to stay a Republican, but I want my party to get better quick. But I will say this about the candidate quality issue, and this is the sad part to me. if Carrie Lake would have never met the past president, she would make an excellent candidate for the future, for our party. But she met him, and as a result, that's my opinion. So there's a big difference between Carrie Lake as a candidate and Herschel Walker as a candidate. You know, so candidate quality has got its degrees, and I think our party has to look to the younger generation. So I'm going to turn the tables here and talk about younger Americans. What are the trends that we just saw in the midterm with who's activated and where these voters are coming from? I've actually tweeted, and I'm guilty of saying everybody over 70 years old in Washington, D.C. needs to go home. I've said that because it's just like I'm over all of the old people making all the decisions and all the younger Americans having to live with them. That's kind of where we are. So Eric Erickson is coming to the stage. Thank you. Y'all give him a round of applause just for the extra effort. The extra effort of sitting on the tarmac in Atlanta. We all love Delta. I've seen your tweets about Delta. I like Delta too. But so before I jump to this next question, I just turn these ladies, and maybe we can get an extra 5 minutes because Eric's here, towards younger voters. What just happened? Let's analyze this. And then after they answer that question, Eric, I'm going to go straight to you with the toughest question of the day, and that is Donald J. Trump leaking oil? So prepare for that question. Ladies, talk about younger voters and what just happened in this midterm.
I mean, we did see a higher than expected increase, especially because we typically see those voters drop off in midterm elections. So I think particularly abortion was an issue that really, you know, activated younger voters and women especially. You know, it doesn't meet anywhere the levels of turnout of sort of middle-aged voters or older voters, but I think it helped in places, you know, places like Michigan. We saw longer lines and things in polling places, or even more ballots having to be printed in college cities and different things, college towns and stuff. So, you know, the trick is keeping them engaged, though, and I'm not sure that, you know, if Biden is the nominee again, how much they are going to be engaged. I think, you know, the House, clearly, you know, Democrats, they're moving on to a younger generation now, passing the torch. How does that happen? But you've still got, you know, a president now that's 80 years old. They very much don't like the former president, but you know, is sort of going to be another sort of choice between lesser of two evils maybe if Trump is the nominee.
Sarah.
I'm going to use this question to say something I want to say that's a little different. But and it really is about the future of the Republican Party. And I say this as somebody who was a young Republican. I was a young Republican in college. I came to work in conservative politics, in think tanks, and on policy. But if I had been in college and Donald Trump had been the Republican president, I never would have been a Republican, never. And so think about what's happening to people who've come into politics in the last 7 years, who've become Republicans, have come because they like what Trump offered, right? And so the Republican Party is working itself into a very boxed-in position where the gap between the primary voters who voted for Doug Mastriano, who voted for Carrie Lake, who put these guys and who were responsive to Donald Trump. I mean, in the focus groups, you listen to Pennsylvania voters, especially young ones, say, I don't know, I voted for Oz because Donald Trump's endorsed him. And because that's where they were taking their cues. But that gap between that person and then a general election voter is getting bigger all the time. And it's getting to be harder for them to straddle it candidate-wise. And so not only are more of these young people, I think, becoming Democrats now out of the gate, but the ones that are there want that combative style of politics. I always use this Russian expression, the appetite increases while you're eating. You have to understand that Donald Trump has changed the appetites of Republican primary voters and what they want, especially young people who were very impressionable during the age of Donald Trump. And Turning Point USA is one of the most powerful groups now that exists on the right that is, you know, and that's the one where you get the kids getting up asking the questions like, when do we get to use the guns? And so the radicalization of young people within the party, I think, has been a huge problem and is going to be a problem that hurts Republicans for a while to come.
And at the same time, Dan Crenshaw and Mike Gallagher are two of the smartest, youngest, most effective conservative members of Congress that we've seen in 50 years. And I know them both really well. So there's a counterpoint to what you're saying. I get that. Eric Erickson, I am a Reagan Republican. In 1980, I voted for Ronald Reagan at Woolen Gym at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I took 3 carloads of my fraternity brothers to D.C. We were here. I shook Howard Baker's hand the night Ronald Reagan became a Republican, became president, and I've been a Republican ever since. Eric is the previous president leaking oil, And what do you say about what just happened in the midterms?
You know, yes, he's been leaking oil since sometime after January 20th, 2017. The question is, and this gets to the point Sarah made, though, you've got this younger group of 19 and 20-somethings who, unless the donors had an epiphany after the midterms and stopped funding crap organizations that actually don't do anything to bring people to the GOP, they're going to have a problem. I do think, though, at the end of the day, it was George W. Bush a couple of years ago said the Republican Party doesn't like losers. And it took a while, I think, for that to penetrate. But you had 2017 or 2018 that you could explain as well. It was a midterm with the president of the White House's party does poorly anyway. That's why they lost. Then they had to concoct the 2020 the election was stolen nonsense to explain 2020. So then you get to 2022 and the party that controls the White House didn't do so bad, and all of the Republicans who didn't wrap themselves around Donald Trump won. So how do you explain that? And I'm sure there are people better at cult apologetics than I am to be able to rationalize how that's so. But when you've got Blake Masters in Arizona underperformed the rest of the Arizona GOP by 11 points, and Kerry Lake underperformed by 6 points, yet they were still able to win seats and do well in the congressional districts and keep the state legislature that no one expected them to keep, except losing seats of those who were too pro-Trump. It's like you see the smoke of the car in front of you down the road burning oil and you're not sure where the smoke comes from. Eventually you catch up to it and you see, oh, it's this car. It's Trump 2024 that I think is burning oil. And will he be able to cross the finish line to 2024? I'm not sure he will, although I didn't think he would actually get elected in 2016, so I'm probably not the best one to say it, but I've pretty much called most of the elections since as they were. Other than I actually thought the GOP was going to do better at this one. I call it Schrodinger's election. If you look at it, the wave was dead. If you don't, there was a wave. If you look in North Carolina, you look in Iowa, you look in even in New York congressional races, look in Georgia and elsewhere where people weren't tied to Trump, Republicans did fairly well. You look in Pennsylvania, you look in Arizona, you look at Michigan, for God's sakes. Donald Trump is doing a great job of turning voters against Trump-like candidates, and that's not sustainable. Either Trump burns oil and he doesn't get across the finish line, or the voters are fed up enough in 2024, they stick with the Democratic Party. They clearly showed in 2022 they don't like any more than they like the Republicans, but they'd rather a status quo that sucks than a party that might be crazy.
Jessica, you got something to say about that?
Well, I wanted to say one thing about the primaries, which both of them have brought up, that look at the members who have left in the past few years. It's been the moderate Republicans and it's been the moderate Democrats. I mean, blue dogs are essentially extinct right now, and that middle caucus, yeah. And to win a primary, more members are motivated by trying to avoid a primary challenge than they are general elections in many instances, especially if they come from either a safe Republican or Democratic seat, and this happens on both sides. I'm watching over the next few years because we've seen election reforms in Maine now that has ranked choice voting. In Alaska, which I think was critical, with the ranked choice top 4 primary system that they just instituted this year. Otherwise, Lisa Murkowski was the only Republican up for re-election that did vote to convict Trump in the Senate. Now, I'm not going to count her out even if she lost the primary, because of course she's won a write-in campaign before, but she was somewhat more inoculated. One member that voted in the House for in the House also was in Washington, which also has the top 2 system. So those types of things inoculate them more. And Nevada has moved one step forward to implementing that with a similar to Alaska, except it would be a top 5 primary system. They have to approve that again on the 2024 ballot. But these ways to move away from just, winner take all primaries when I've seen candidates, my home district of Tennessee's 1st district, when it was open last year, the Republican, I think it was 16 candidate field won with like 18% of the vote. And, that's not representative of what most people want. So, if it's states that have runoffs where you do have to win that in the primaries, or it is these top primary systems, that they are more appealing to general election candidates in a way, and that you can win with fringe candidates would then sort of get lopped off in the way that Sarah Palin did in Alaska.
Barbara, we'll come to you with the question in a minute, but I want to ask Sarah a question. You've done a lot of, you mentioned earlier, focus groups around independence. Where do you think independent voters are going between here and 2024? I told people a year ago I'm almost equally disgusted with both political parties, and that still holds true. I mean, there's a lot of Americans that are just like disgusted with partisan politics. So are people actually becoming more independent? What did you find out in your focus groups?
One of the most earnest fights I will pick with good people is the idea that there's an exhausted majority. Because I don't believe that there's an exhausted majority. I think there is a very animated sort of majority on both sides that is picking primary candidates, and then there's like an exhausted middle, where like if you listen to the swing voter groups, independent groups, they're so sad. They're like the saddest. They just want better candidates. They just want people to be normal. They just want people to be sane. And one of the craziest things that I've ever seen was the Republicans electing Glenn Youngkin in an off-year election when everybody looked and went, oh my God, look at that. That's a 12-point swing. That's amazing. What is that? Let's go on to nominate candidates that absolutely do not reflect that winning strategy that we just saw in like a bluish state, in a bluish state. And instead nominated these extreme candidates. And so I think that if either party, one of the two parties is going to figure out, and Democrats did last time, nominating Joe Biden, this perceived, and you heard it from independents and all the groups, they're like, he's fine. Fine. He's better than Trump. That guy's a lunatic. And so, nominate normal people, and normal people will vote for them. That is you've got to get past this primary trick. There's got to be one weird trick to get, yeah.
Your second, Jane. Barbara, former Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, first question.
I am so sorry, Barbara, but we've got a senator in the back of the House. And so if it's okay with you, we're going to hold that question for lunch, and we're going to ask our panelists if y'all will hang with us for lunch, and we're going to rotate a little bit through here, and we'll take more questions
We'll
at the noon hour.
accept that if we get more time after lunch. And welcome, Senator Klobuchar.
That is exactly what I'm saying, Zach Wamp.
Okay. Thank you. We'll be back. Eric, thanks.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to be late.
Good job. We're going to pick that back up.
Thank you, panelists. Yeah, thank you. Great job. How about another round of applause for that terrific panel? And we hope to see them at lunch and hear more from them and be able to ask them some direct questions. So I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce our next speaker. And Senator, I have to say, you are now not only recognized in the state of Minnesota, nationally, but internationally, everywhere you go. I am recognized in my little hometown airport of South Bend, Indiana. And I was back there the other day, and somebody walked up to me and said, oh, you've done some good things on the 9/11 Commission, served overseas as ambassador and congressman. You're working on this democracy issue. You've got kids and maybe grandkids. What in the world are you doing, Tim? And I said, it's precisely because I have kids and I care about where we're going as a country. And the best thing we can do for our kids is to preserve this fragile and treasured republic and this democracy. So we all are here as Democrats and Republicans for that reason. We don't all agree on a lot of issues, but we agree on preserving this great system of representative democracy. There are 4 things that will do it. 1, great organizations like the National Council on Election Integrity and Issue 1 Reformers Caucus. Those bipartisan organizations coming together, working to form the middle with people like Senator Klobuchar, that is the kind of organization that America needs, putting country before party. 2, elections, fair, secure elections, where America sings. Walt Whitman has a great poem called I Hear America Sing. And we heard America sing in the last election. In Minnesota, in Nevada, in Michigan, in all of Pennsylvania, we had great results, not just for Democrats or Republicans, but for Americans, for a sound election system. Thirdly, our justice system has to work. And we're now hearing about convictions of people who attacked our Capitol. In fact, yesterday, somebody getting the former organizer of the Oath Keepers getting convicted of seditious conspiracy, up to 20 years in jail. Those kinds of things working will affect the people's trust in our elections. And 4th, what we need is the reform of the Electoral Count Act to make sure January 6th never, ever happens again. That will update laws that were written in 1887, bring our system into the modern century, and better define the role of states and the vice president and members of Congress. Nobody has worked harder on that Electoral Count Reform Act than Senator Klobuchar. She has tirelessly worked from her role on the Rules Committee as a respected senator, as a leader of the United States Senate to get this done. There are a couple sets of names, Klobuchar and Blunt, Collins and Manchin, Schumer and McConnell. Those people have brought the Senate together to get this done. We are so thankful for Senator Klobuchar's leadership and direction and vision to get this act hopefully across the finish line in the next few days. Senator Klobuchar's grandfather worked in the mines up in northern Minnesota. She comes from the Labor and Farmers Party in Minnesota, works for the blue-collar people. She was the first elected woman from the state of Minnesota to the United States Senate, and Vanderbilt University said about her, they said, this is the most effective Democratic senator in the 115th Congress. So with that, let me introduce my friend, Amy Klobuchar. Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. The guy that went from Indiana to India, pretty good. And thank you so much, Ambassador, for your great leadership. And it's so fun to be here with this group, this bipartisan group, and to be away from the Capitol for a little bit and talk about what we can get done by the end of the year, which is honestly my focus right now. Because things are a little crazy over in the House of Representatives. Hi, Donna. Good to see you. Not that they ever were before. But it is really imperative that we get this Electoral Count Act done by the end of the year. And I know you heard from Senator Manchin and probably others today that told you the same thing. I want to thank Nick and the National Council on Election Integrity. I want to thank my good friend Mary Landrieu, who knows a little bit. She was a mentor to me when we were in the Senate. I took over the adoption caucus with Senator Blunt after Mary left. And I literally watched Mary on the Senate floor and how she got stuff done for her state and has remained a really, really good friend. Jane Harmon, thank you for your incredible leadership. We were just with a group of Jewish leaders over in the Senate, and one of the major topics that we were talking about and that we were asking their help for was Ukraine right now, Afghan refugees, all of these issues around the world that Jane understands so well that are very much connected to democracy. Because we are the beacon of democracy across the world, yes, but only if our democracy works here at home. So for me, my last 2 years got defined by January 6th. Why? Because it was Senator Blunt and myself that were in charge of the Rules Committee that day. We were the ones in the room where all the senators were with the pages when we were removed from the Senate floor who were in charge. As the leaders, as you know now from watching the videos from the January 6th committees, were in a separate room. And we were the ones at 4 in the morning with Vice President Pence that were the last senators there. Everyone had gone home. And we walked through what had been a corridor of celebration in the morning from the Senate to the House, of this ceremony that had been around, as you know, for over 100 years, to walking over broken glass, to walking by spray-painted columns with still these 3 pairs of young women who were holding the mahogany boxes that had the last of the electoral ballots in up to Wyoming. And we got over to the House and we said democracy has prevailed, and it did. And 2 weeks later, there we were on the stage of the inauguration with those little snowflakes coming down, with the bright blue sky, with President Bush on the stage, with Vice President Quayle and Vice President Pence on the stage, with Democratic leaders on the stage. And it is like the whole thing for me was in Technicolor, with Amanda Gorman with her yellow coat, with Lady Gaga. The only problem was that she and I wore the same dress, and then I had to go home and change. No, that didn't really happen. But with her standing there singing this robust version of the Star Spangled Banner and motioning to the flag, and our flag was still there. The new president and vice president and their families. And I will admit, I was a bit naive that day. I thought, this is it. Democracy has prevailed. We're going on forward. We have all the leaders there. What I didn't understand, I guess, was that the shadow of Donald Trump was still standing and hovering over our democracy. Through it all, there have been some incredibly brave Republicans like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. There have been Republicans willing to work across the aisle with us to pass this incredible array of bills, including investment in the infrastructure and semiconductors and the work that we've done, at least the beginning of the work on gun safety. So I'm kind of a glass half full instead of half empty person in terms of where we can go from here. But I still remain concerned, as I know all you do, or you wouldn't be in this group, about the status of our democracy and how that actually matters, not just for obviously our futures, but for how we work with the rest of the world. Part of this has been going after those that perpetrated these horrendous acts of violence, resulting in a number of police officers dying, resulting in over 100 of them injured. And as chairs of the Rules Committee, Roy and I know firsthand the morale damage that was done right after January 6th, and the improvements we've seen, which has been one of my hidden jobs over the last few months with our Capitol Police. We have to do more about threats on elected officials. We have seen a 10-time increase. 10-time increase in just the last 4 or 5 years on threats against elected officials on both sides of the aisle. A little note, we have an amendment. It's called the Klobuchar-Cruz Amendment, just exactly what you thought I would say. But it is to allow members to take their own addresses off the internet, just like we're going to be doing for judges. It's created a huge problem for members, and so we have to do that. We're looking at increased security, and we're seeing the same thing, of course, with judges and their staff. The recent incident with Justice Kavanaugh in his neighborhood, but also with what we're seeing with one judge whose son was gunned down out of New Jersey, just by opening the door of their home. We have seen this with election officials, where they're reporting 1 out of 6 has reported threats of violence against them. So this is something that is ongoing, in addition to the work that we have to do to support the Electoral Count Act. And one of the ways we do this is, yes, up our security, but the other is to actually prosecute these cases. So we're working with the Justice Department because just as they have been prosecuting the perpetrators of January 6th, you really have to make sure these cases, because as a former prosecutor, I believe that you can set a standard and set a message, and if you just let all of it go, it's only going to get worse, as we saw from the attack on Paul Pelosi. As Tim was talking, I was thinking about, does democracy matter to people? And this is a bipartisan group, but I will report to you one Democratic poll I saw that showed after the midterms that 33% of people who voted for Democratic candidates, whether they be moderate Republicans, independents, or Democrats, gave the #1 reason: democracy. And I think some of it was the threats, violent threats. I think some of it was obviously the election denier candidates. And I'm not actually going partisan here, I'm going bipartisan here in trying to make this case that it actually was a major issue for people. And I'm sure there are people within the Republican Party looking at it. Elections always give you a moment of self-examination, right? And to me, what you should do is change your policies and your candidates and not try to change the voters and who can vote. And so that's what I hope will come out of all this, because it didn't really work out very well. That's I noticed my speech said election reflection. That's my election reflection. Okay, the Electoral Count Act. Let me talk a little bit about that and what's happening. I know Joe talked today, and I don't know if you heard from Susan, but they've done a tremendous job. Roy and I addressed their group a number of times, and we also came up with some changes that were bipartisan based on the hearing we had that went incredibly well with lawyers for both parties testifying. So we got that through out of the committee on a 14-1 vote. The one vote against us was Senator Cruz, and he did make the case that he would rather go back to a commission like they had during the days of Rutherford B. Hayes, which was like 1887 or something like that. And I made the point that I didn't really like that year because women couldn't vote. Wasn't a good year for me. And so we are moving forward now, including with support for that bill from people like Cindy Hyde-Smith, very conservative Republicans who voted for the bill. So we're in very good stead when it comes to support for the Senate bill. I think you know what it does. It explicitly rejects this claim that somehow the vice president can override the will of the people. That was the hang Mike Pence cries, the horror of all of that, and it makes that very clear. Secondly, it says that 20% of the House, 20% of the Senate would have to object in order for us to go back and debate an individual state. To give you the sense of what Roy and I were expecting before the insurrection happened, we'd worked on it for weeks. We knew we had like 90 votes. We actually called people like you do and figured out where people were. We had somewhere between 88 and 92 votes for upholding the Electoral College. We knew that going in, and that's why the whole day I knew we still had those votes, because we only gained more people through the thing. But we thought it was going to take 24 to 36 hours just to go through the 6 objections that we expected to the states of Nevada and Arizona, and I'm not going to go through the whole roster here, Pennsylvania, you know what they were. And so Wisconsin, always a state that they go after, so we knew this was going to happen. But honestly, if the law stays as is, someone in each chamber, one person, as long as you have one in each chamber, could object to every single state, including the state that your candidate won, just to muck it up. And then you go back to each chamber, you have hours and hours of debate. It could take 3 to 4 days going through the night, and as you know, with the age of some of our senators, they're not really of the age to pull all-nighters. I'm not gonna go into it. But it is a ridiculous system that doesn't work when you don't have comedy and you have people that are trying to play it and have no respect for our democracy. And so that's why this 20% number, it's 25% in the House, but and I would prefer that. Angus and Dick Durbin and I had a bill originally that was 25%. We actually led the effort on this, shared our work with the group, but we're at 20%. We're working with the House. I've talked to Zoe, I've talked to Liz Cheney several times to see if we can make some of their changes. There's some technical changes that we are in the process of accepting. So next up, we wanted to make sure that you couldn't pick the slate of electors after the election, that had to be set before, and then we set up some reasonable appeal processes. So I'm not going to go through more on that, but there was some widespread belief that we actually improved the bill coming out of the Rules Committee. So next up, how do we get it done by the end of the year? Several vehicles, NDAA, which is coming right up. And the second one, of course, is the omnibus bill, which is looking more and more, despite all the chaos going on in general, omnibus looking more and more promising in terms of moving on an omnibus. And that's coming out of the meeting and at the White House and the like. So we're hopeful, we're very hopeful, Senator Schumer is, that we'll be able to get the omnibus. That's the best vehicle. Then the next thing we're left with is just a group of us saying we're not going to go home, which has happened before, until we get this passed, which I would do. I don't know how I do it, but find some way to do it. And so I'm hoping I'm not going to get to that moment because we have to get this done by the end of the year. And Mitch and Chuck are devoted to getting this done. So that's why I feel like I've got some pretty good allies here. They both serve on my committee. It's the only committee they serve on. And so we're very hopeful we can keep going from there. Last thing I just want to quickly mention and then do some questions is election disinformation. As you know, I've been leading some of the efforts with the tech companies. As my husband said this summer to our daughter when she was home for the weekend, be nice to your mom. She has the 4 biggest companies in the world going after her, and she was just banned from Russia. And so what I am trying to do here, respecting these companies, is to put some rules of the road in place. Some of it is Maria is leading, Cantwell and others are leading the effort on privacy, which would be privacy bill. The fact that we don't have a federal one, super sad. Putting some rules in the road in place with disinformation and content. We have bills that would remove the Section 230 immunity for certain kinds of conduct, just because we don't know how else we're going to ensure that this doesn't continue. Other countries have different laws in place, like in Europe, but it has enabled them to have more power to do that, like election disinformation and vaccine disinformation in a public health crisis and the like. The third thing is, of course, the monopoly issue, and I'm a big believer in capitalism, so part of my argument here is you can't have new bells and whistles developed if you don't have competition when it comes to privacy and when it comes to disinformation. So that's a piece of our work. And then the last thing I would just mention is just voter protection overall, stopping the voter suppression. We were successful in getting every senator on my Freedom to Vote Act. I led that bill, including Senator Manchin, signed on the dotted line. As Mary knows, we really don't sign on the dotted line, but it's just kind of a euphemism. But he supported that bill, and then we were not able to advance it because of being 2 votes short on an exemption, not an exemption, to the filibuster. So that is still hanging out there. It was a bill where we were able to work out some issues people had, and it would guarantee some minimum voting standards. One very last thing I want to call your attention to is next week the Supreme Court's going to be hearing this case out of the, thank you, person that knows what it is, out of the North Carolina legislature. And this is so interesting. I would suggest tuning in on this one. I'm going to be there, actually. This is a case where the North Carolina legislature did a gerrymandered map. It went up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and they rejected the map. And then the North Carolina legislature went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said, in what I most consider an unconstitutional power grab, we're not bound by the North Carolina Supreme Court. They can't review our stuff. Because of the elections clause that says the legislatures can set the time, place, and manner of elections, we don't have any limits on us. So I filed an amicus brief with 19 of my colleagues, but what is very interesting is that all the state Supreme Court chief justices in the country, in an incredibly rare move from liberal to very conservative, filed a joint brief on the same side as us, saying that you cannot get rid of state Supreme Court review on these election cases. And they were joined by other briefs filed by Calabrese, by Ben Ginsberg. So there's actually a chance that we might win this one. And if we don't, it is very scary for what this means for election law going forward. So on that diabolical end, I'd love to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nick Penniman. So what we're going to do is just take 2 questions from National Council on Election Integrity members, because this today is ostensibly an education process for them, and then let the senator go because she's on a tight schedule. So any NCI members have a question for Amy? Yes, Amber.
Hi, Senator Klobuchar.
Hi.
And, thanks for all of your amazing work on supporting election officials and also voting access. I'm going to give you an easy one. So Minnesota, again, has the top turnout, I think by like 0.5%.
Oh, yeah, that's
point.
called a softball. I actually didn't know what the results were for this year. Because Bennett was betting me and going all over his state saying Colorado would beat us. So
it's not all official yet, but Minnesota looks to be leading. But I bring that up because, and actually my friend Zach Wamp, I don't know if he walked out, but he's from Tennessee, and we had Senator Manchin here. And Tennessee and West Virginia are actually at the very low end of the spectrum on turnout at 30-some% of voting eligible population, and then Minnesota is up at 60. So we've got about a 30-point discrepancy between states on this stuff. And so I'd love your comments on, you know, obviously voting access matters, but a significant difference, and it seems to me that that's an important issue to address.
And I think it's really important to look at, when you look at some of the top numbers, it's very related to one thing that I don't think you're going to think I'm going to say, which is same-day registration. And when you have states that are red states or purple states that have this, they actually are very high up as well. And what same-day registration does, of course, with rules in place about you have to show up with a neighbor or with a gas bill or all these things, and it has to be checked later. It does allow people, and it's not just about students, it's about people that have moved, and then they're able to show up when they decide they're going to vote and register. My view on this, having come from a state, if you don't think I understand independent voters, I have 3 words for you: Governor Jesse Ventura. Having come from a state that has had Tim Pawlenty as governor and Michelle Bachmann in Congress, like for us, what it's done, it's recently turned more blue, yes, but for us, what it's done through red times, purple times, blue times, people feel part of the franchise. I can't tell you how important it is. I have people come up to me all the time at the state fair, where my booth is next to the snake zoo and the My Pillow guy. Just, well, leave that hanging out there. They're based in Minnesota. I have people come up all the time and say, you know, I didn't vote for you, but I do like this one thing you did. There's just something about it when you have more people voting that they feel part of the franchise. That's why I'm so devoted to this. And we have seen elections where people vote in droves and it's elected Democrats, but it's also elected Republicans. So the same-day registration matters. The ease in voting for, of course, mail-in ballots and requesting your mail-in ballots, and all of these things are going to matter. But what's so appealing to me, and what's so sad, it's turned partisan, honestly, from where we were on the John Lewis bill reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, when it was all bipartisan, everyone voted for it. George Bush did a press conference celebrating its reauthorization. Well, that we've gone away from that is really hard. Having minimum standards in place when things have gotten so complicated, and you have you know, people in certain states doing some really bad stuff, and then you see images, I remember from that primary during the pandemic, of people in Milwaukee in these garbage bags in the rain with these homemade masks, risking their very lives to vote. We have to show the courage of them. And to me, that means putting in some minimal standards when it comes to what the voting rules should be for the country, so that we actually will, by doing that, I believe you give people more faith in our democracy and in our country. So that is where I am on that. And we are, you know, it would have to be a filibuster issue, but now the House won't pass it anyway, so let's be honest. So right now we can't move on that, but you never know what we could move on election official protection and some other things that we are working on. And now Deb Fisher is going to be taking Roy's place on the Rules Committee. And when she got to the Senate, she asked me to be her Democratic mentor, yes. Barrasso was her Republican one, so I work with her well, and hoping we can continue the tradition that Roy and I have had of working together so well. Okay.
One final question for the senator. Yes, Donna? And then we'll take a 5-minute break, folks, after this. Here you go.
I'll be quick. Thanks, Senator. My question just has to do with resources. We tried to explore this a little bit with Senator Manchin when he was here earlier, that, in some states, voters are waiting in line hours and hours. It's a matter of having, additional polling locations and voting machines and those kind of structural things that states really need help with. So what are the possibilities of exploring those kind of infrastructure supports for states without telling them how to conduct their elections?
Sure, and that's, we've done a lot of that through the Election Assistance Commission. And Roy and I upped some of the money and got agreement from our leaders during the pandemic because of these great changes, right? And that is another way we have approached this. And I think, one, we did do a letter to them, Roy and I did, saying that they should be able to use that money for security. These areas some of them are in pretty remote locations. They had no police. It was really a scary thing, and I think we got through this election in a good way on that. The disinformation stuff, which tends to be from Homeland Security and law enforcement, there's been huge investments in that. And 2 elections in a row now, both Homeland Security has declared them safe so we have that issue. And then we have what you're talking about, which is the unfairness of people standing in line. When I did the field hearing for the Rules Committee in Georgia, I heard the story of directly from him, a veteran who said, when I signed up to serve, there wasn't a waiting line. And then when I come home to vote in Georgia here, it's a 5-hour waiting line in the hot sun. And the stories of how polling places were moved around. Someone had voted one place for the primary, another place for the general, and another place for the runoff. And so that is not just Georgia. This has been happening in other states around the country. So that's why I am in favor of more resources to help with the infrastructure. You tie the resources, of course, which we did with the Freedom to Vote Act. You tie it with, okay, you've got to have this, you have to have ballot boxes per population. You've got to have those kinds of things. We should be tying the resources we give to carrots, right? It's carrots that you're talking about, as opposed to the stick of putting something in place, which I would prefer. But if we're not going to be able to pass it, this is one way to do it. But we should insist on some carrots that go with it. So, good point.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your
Okay.
persistence and your hard work.
You. Right, and I want to thank Elizabeth and Steve over here, our Rules Committee staff, who are doing a fantastic job as well.
Okay, folks, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the next panel.
Hi, everybody. If we could take seats, we're going to get to the next panel in just a moment. So I invite everyone to take their seats. So good morning, everybody. My name is Dochi Fasihian, and it's time now to talk about some of our heroes, election officials, and the work that they do for our democracy. The next panel will talk about various types of threats that could affect future elections in our country. One of those problems, threats and intimidation to American election officials, is a policy priority for my program, Faces of Democracy. Our program aims to lift up, celebrate, and make sure that our election officials and poll workers are getting the support that they need to do the work that they do for our democracy. A couple of members of that program are here today in the room. I don't see them right now in the room, but hopefully they can later introduce themselves to all of you. But I'd like to invite those that are on the panel, I think you guys are already here, great, to take your seats. So moderating the next panel is Amber McReynolds. She's a former election official and current governor of the United States Post Office. Amber is well known to many of us as a trusted go-to for common sense advice about election administration and a known national expert on elections, and she's been very instrumental in helping us launch our Faces of Democracy program. Joining Amber are election experts bringing different perspectives. I do want to say that Acting Secretary of State Lee Chapman was supposed to be with us today, but unfortunately she was held back in Pennsylvania due to the certification process, so she was unable to be with us today. But we have Steve Richer, the county recorder or chief election official for Arizona's Maricopa County. All eyes on Maricopa County. We can't wait to hear his perspective on how it feels to manage an election that is so closely watched by all sides and in the national spotlight. We are so thankful that he can be here with us and thankful for all his work that he's doing. And also Kim Wyman, Senior Election and Security Advisor for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, as most of us know it. She's also a former election official. Please help me welcome them. And Amber, I'm turning it off to you.
Well, thank you so much to Issue 1 and the National Council, which I also serve on, and it's an honor to be a part of the council since 2020, and thanks to everyone for coordinating and this amazing event. I think we've already heard some amazing perspectives about the midterm election, and I'm certainly excited to have a chance to moderate this panel with two of my really good friends in this space and two amazing election officials. And on this stage also, I should mention all three of us have managed elections at the local level. Kim was a Secretary of State of Washington for many years and now working at the federal level. I worked at the local level, have now worked on a number of national issues. So there's a wealth of knowledge about election administration on here, which is fantastic. And then we've also got the Maricopa County recorder here who used to work at SpaceX, and that's why he has zapped himself here from being in Maricopa so quickly to be with us today. So as we get started on this panel, obviously election administration has been at the forefront of the topics that Issue 1 has been talking about and the country has been talking about overall. And I want to start talking about the threats and the different types of threats that are facing American elections. Kim Wyman, who is now at CISA, and CISA has been working on these issues since elections were designated as critical infrastructure in January 2017 by then outgoing President Obama. So that's the first time elections were deemed critical infrastructure, became a priority for CISA. And so it's been a fairly short time frame since that happened, and CISA's been doing incredible work to ensure elections are secure. And there's really three basic categories, so physical security threats, misinformation threats, and cyber threats. So first, Kim, talk a little bit about your analysis of the 2022 cycle, your work at CISA, how you think things went, and maybe a few practical solutions and issues for the future.
Okay, that's big. Well, first, I think 2022, I got my wish. I wished for an uneventful election, and by and large, that's what happened. I think as we were going into 2022, election officials across the country were certainly expressing to me their concerns, particularly about physical threats of violence towards them and their staff. People weren't sure what the polling places were going to be like on election day or in the days leading up for drop boxes. So there was a lot of tension, I think, going into 22 that we were hearing at the federal level of what are we going to do when these threats that we really haven't seen before happen. So you know, CISA, we really focused and worked very closely with the FBI and the election crime coordinators. We worked with our physical security advisors who are in all 50 states and work very closely with local and state election officials to just, you know, try to anticipate what could happen. We did de-escalation training of election officials and really just tried to prepare them. And I think that's really the role CISA plays, is trying to bring the vast resources of the federal government to bear for state, local, tribal, and territorial election officials to be able to deal with threats that are not only happening in their own backyards, but happening from foreign state actors, happening from cyber criminals. And so it's really trying to just, you know, build those relationships. And that was, as I look back now on Election Day, 3 or so weeks ago, the things we were really worried about didn't seem to materialize in the way we thought they would, so I think that's good. I think that we still have to have an eye to 24, that those threats are still out there, they're still real, and, you know, our job is to not only build the security of that critical infrastructure, but also build the resilience of those state and local election offices to be able to keep their systems secure and ultimately to instill confidence in the American public.
Thanks so much. And Stephen, being from Maricopa, a lot of drama in Maricopa, 2020 drama, 2022. Talk a little bit about that environment and what you've had to do over the last 2 years to prepare for 2022, and how you're responding to really what is the continuance of a lot of the impacts of mis and disinfo in Maricopa.
Yeah, I took office on January 4th, 2021, on my third day in office when I was still trying to figure out how the phone system worked and how to get access to my email. I had to send everyone home because we had people outside of our office on January 6th, 2021, and we've had our fists up ever since. And so in many respects, the November election was just another day in the office, and sometimes those days aren't necessarily pleasant. My mom had a colonoscopy on November 10th, and she was describing her day to me, and I said, that sounds actually pretty pleasant compared to some of the stuff that I'm going through right now. You know, we have been in the eye of the storm, and if you can imagine it, it's happened to us. I really worry. I'm shocked that we haven't lost more people in my office, but we've weathered the storm. The August primary was very successful. I oversee early voting, mail voting, and voter registration for Maricopa County, and in the November general election, that was about 85% of the vote. And then the Board of Supervisors, which is a 5-member board elected at geographically oversees election day, and we had some issues there. They jumped on it pretty quickly and had those solved. But where we really got our teeth kicked in was in the days after the election, because we are a heavy mail state. We are a heavy early ballot dropped off on election day state, and that means that we don't have as high a percentage of our results available on Tuesday election night or even on Wednesday. And on Tuesday election night, that doesn't matter so much because everyone's thinking about their own states. But then when you start to get to Wednesday and Thursday and the entire country is looking at your state and Nevada, thank God they were having this as well, then that's when it gets really, really, really ugly. That's when you start getting a lot of random area codes calling your personal cell phone, telling you what they think about you. You know, that might be something that Arizona has to reconsider in terms of its election laws, and it's unfortunate. It's because it's not driven by anything that's real, but it is driven by the perception that a prolonged, protracted process, when we had some of our statewide races determined by fewer than 600 votes, causes.
Thanks, Stephen. And to follow up on something you just said, I mean, what would you like to see more at the federal level to help offices like yours, whether that be the physical security threat piece or potential policies in Congress? Like, what are your thoughts about what should be done?
I think it's more of a cultural issue at this point. I think that the federal government has done or at least the direction from Attorney General Garland has been clear that these threats will not be tolerated. We've seen prosecutions start to happen. Somebody has been prosecuted who lived in Missouri who made a death threat to me. That's ongoing. From the federal government, I'm a believer with Ben, who spoke earlier, that most of this should happen at the state level. I think members of the media have gotten a lot better about not assuming what happens in Pennsylvania should be exactly what happens in Florida, should be exactly what happens in Arizona, should be exactly what happens in Washington, and that's been very helpful. And I would say the main difference between 2020 and 2022 is that we had a very well-educated media that was able to address some of these issues without even having to contact election officials, was able to level set expectations such that no matter how unpleasant it was these last few weeks, it would have been worse if the media hadn't been prepared for that.
And Kim, so what, in terms of going into 2024 and going in the future, what are some of the things that CISA is focused on and how to improve and lift up? I mean, I'm going to ask Stephen about this in a minute, but Maricopa, I think, has become very much a model of transparency, and that seems to be a really good model for others to emulate. But things like that, what are you all working on that will be a focus for 2024?
Well, obviously in the election world, you start thinking about the next big election the day after the election, even when you're still working on it and certifying things. So we're no different at CISA. We are already looking towards that pivot to 24. And there's really 3 areas of focus that we have, and you've already said them: cybersecurity, physical security, and mis and disinformation. So on the cybersecurity front, first and foremost, the threat actors are both foreign, state-sponsored threat actors and cyber criminals. And so we really focus our energy on trying to provide resources for state, local, tribal, territorial election offices to be able to strengthen and harden their defenses. So we have no-cost services that are available that range from, cyber hygiene scanning and vulnerability scanning to one of the things that I know we're going to put a big emphasis on going into 2024 is trying to get more of these state and local offices on the .gov top-level domain platform. And this does a number of things. One, it does help secure their systems, but also it's a simple thing to message to the American public. If you are looking for official information, the trusted source is a .gov, because you're dealing with a government entity and not maybe an organization that is trying to emulate or mislead you in information. So that's kind of, we're going to really focus on basic cyber hygiene and that type of thing. In the physical security realm, as I mentioned, we have protective security advisors in all 50 states, and they work directly with those state and local partners, doing physical assessments of their election office or a voting center, and really trying to give them feedback that will help secure those facilities. And as I think everyone in this room knows, the challenge for election officials is you have to have public facilities that are accessible. And it's really hard to make a secure, accessible location, and I'm sure that Stephen can talk to that better than I can. So we can bring those types of services front and center and help them secure those facilities. And then on the mis and disinformation front, we really kind of have 3 approaches for that. First and foremost is just educating people of those disinformation tactics that are being used on them and making them aware of it. And secondly, trying to build resilience in the American public, that things that you see on social media may be trying to influence you and influence the way that you think about election security, which dovetails into our third kind of area, is really trying to share with the American public how state and local election officials are securing their infrastructure and making those election offices secure by amplifying their voices. And so those are really the places that we're spending time and we're going to be looking to 24 to enhance.
Well, and this question is for both of you. Stephen, I'm going to start with you. You're a huge college football fan. See, I got that in there. Huge game on Saturday, Michigan versus Ohio State. Michigan pummeled Ohio State in football, and they also beat them handedly in Turnout. So two things there. And I want to bring up Turnout, because you and I were having a discussion about this. Policies matter, and the top states for turnout are usually consistent, and then the bottom states for turnout are usually consistent. So this year, right now, Tennessee and West Virginia are fighting it out for last place in turnout, around 34, 35, 36%. The top states are at 60, 61, 62, so almost a 30-point difference, similar in 2020 to that. So talk a little, and both of you can, I'd love both of you to weigh in on this, but clearly states vary greatly, and while that can be a strength, the inconsistencies can create a lot of issues too. So just talk about the impact of turnout and how you see this, and maybe what some of your ideas might be for potentially best practices to be passed by Congress at the federal level to maybe help close some of that gap that exists.
Yeah, I was surprised. Michigan hasn't done well against Ohio State, and then to go to the horseshoe and win by like that was an impressive offensive performance. I'm a bit of a heretic on this among election officials. I don't think it is that voter turnout for the sake of voter turnout is an inherent correlative factor with the health of a democracy, or is necessarily good in and of itself, as long as everyone has access and everyone can have a positive experience if they want to vote. Now, obviously, if you start getting down to like 5%, then you're more of an oligarchy and something's going wrong. But you know, the number one thing that will determine turnout is, you know, is Donald Trump on the ballot again in 2024? Because Donald Trump was on the ballot and we had record-breaking turnout in 2020, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good indicator of a healthy state of politics. You know, I mean, if you feel like your entire world's going to be taken away from you based on the outcome of an election, which I think is a bad thing, then you're probably very likely to go and vote. So as far as state practices, yes, I celebrate the fact that we have different laboratories of democracy, and there are different ways of doing things, and we look to those states, and I've been spending a lot of time on the phone with Florida election officials, because that's the state that a lot of people have been clamoring in the state of Arizona to more closely mimic. And Florida does some things that are different, and there are some advantages to that, there are some disadvantages to that. But where it frustrates me is, and where it would make my life a lot simpler, is if it was completely nationalized, then I wouldn't have to explain, well, in Florida, you have to drop off your early ballot by the close of early voting. In Arizona, you can drop off your early ballot on election day. And so, you know, because they just want to, well, Florida counts everything in one night. And so, you know, there's some good conversation that can come to that, but it also gets weaponized by some of the detractors in our state as this is symptomatic of a broken election, and by the way, that's also symptomatic of the fact that I should have won as a candidate.
Well, so for full disclosure, I come from a state that was a leader in vote by mail and might compete a lot with Colorado, and I'm trying to get from Amber whether or not my former state actually had higher turnout or not than Colorado, but we're not going to be competitive here. Okay, we are. We always are. Who are we kidding? But in my new role, you know, as I look at the challenges that we have with this very decentralized and very diverse way of conducting elections, and I look at this group that I have to just commend you on tackling this work in this, would you say, cross-partisan, I like that even better than bipartisan manner. I think that's where it has to start, and I think you have an opportunity you know, as we're looking at trying to balance access and security, because that is really what it is. Both sides try to make this a partisan issue, that it's about voter suppression and it's about voter fraud. No, it's about balancing access and security so that every American has a right to exercise their constitutionally protected voice in our democracy. And so I think that that's where it has to start, and we have to stop framing it in these partisan terms and really look at how we're going to enable states and champion states to make their own way in how they want to conduct an election, but but do it in a way that advances that inclusion and that transparency of how we conduct elections. You know, and I look from the CISA perspective of really trying to secure our nation's election system, and more importantly, inspire confidence that the election was accessible and secure. We have to figure out a way to talk about it. And I think that's what your group should be really trying to focus on, because once we're transparent, once we show that in Maricopa County, the way we count votes is with a paper ballot, that we can go back and hand count if people so choose. And in fact, we can let another, no, I won't go down that path, organization do it. But sorry. But I think that transparency is the strength of U.S. elections. And the more that we can focus on that, and the more you take away the mystery, the more people start going, well, yeah, I don't like the outcome, but yeah, that was a well-run, fair election. And I think that's the mechanics of it we have to get back to. And we have to be really honest with ourselves about the different things that we do, like making a vote by mail election where you can turn your ballot in up till 8 o'clock election night, or have a postmark, is great for access, but it's going to slow down results tremendously. And again, I think that what the media did a great job in 22 and 2020 as well of explaining to your readers, your viewers, how elections work. The more that happens, the less some of that chatter and that disinformation takes foothold. It's always going to take foothold for some folks on both ends of the spectrum, but we have to focus on, you know, sharing it so the broader electorate goes, yeah, I don't like the outcome, but I think it was fair. And I think that's the work we have to get back to doing.
And you brought up transparency a few times. We brought this up, and Stephen, you've been a champion of transparency. I mean, you are in front of the cameras almost every day, long Twitter feeds explaining the process. Talk a little bit about the impact that you think that's had in Arizona. Has it helped with some of the dis and misinfo that frankly has come from candidates running for the highest offices? Like, you've been fighting this huge misinformation battle and doing so in a very transparent way, but do you think it's having an impact? Like, what are the lessons learned that you have?
I hate this question. Do you think the last 2 years of all your work have made any difference? It's like, yes, I know it has. I just have to come up with the data for it. You know, we see it on an individualized level when people come in and take tours. We see them say, you know, okay, well, I understand that process. Now, very few people walk away with a spiritual revelation that, like, oh my gosh, I've been lied to all along and this is really safe. We'll hear a lot of, you know, okay, well, maybe it wasn't that theory, okay, but I still heard something else, or okay, maybe I believe in Arizona, but those people in Michigan, which part of me is like, yes, but no, sort of thing in terms of when they turn that. But the longitudinal studies, as I would imagine people like Sarah Longwell would know better than anyone, you know, haven't been heartening. That a large percentage of the population still believes that, you know, the 2020 election was somehow the product of inaccuracy or theft. That's disheartening. I went to yeshiva for a brief time. Nobody in their right mind would have made me a rabbi. For some people, this is a matter of faith. I've dropped out of that world and can't really pretend to convert somebody. So part of what we do as far as transparency is because that's what we have. Those are the tools that we have. And so we've gone whole hog on that. This is still new to election administrators. Please have patience with us, because many election jurisdictions, Maricopa County not being one of them, but we're the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, didn't even have public officials or media people prior to 2020 because there just wasn't that much interest. And so we're catching up. But we still have a lot of work to do, and hopefully some of it will yield dividends. And perhaps the fact that, for the most part, people are accepting election results, except for in my lovely state, is a sign that there was improvement as a result of transparency and communication for the 2022 midterms.
It's great, thank you. And so kind of in the final, and then we'll take a few questions. When we look back over history, 19th Amendment enfranchised half of the country that couldn't vote before. The Voting Rights Act enfranchised and ensured the right to vote for everyone. Then we go up to an NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, in the 1990s. It was a bipartisan bill. HAVA, signed right after Florida 2000, bipartisan bill that set up the EAC and accessibility standards. UACAVA, UMUVA, all bipartisan. So all of these federal pieces of legislation I just mentioned, all were passed or even signed by Republican presidents, passed by Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate, and attempted to set up national standards. But National Voter Registration Act being from 1993 and mentioning pen and paper and before the internet, obviously there's some modernization that could happen. So it seems like we are at the right moment for some level or some reset or some opportunity to pursue national standards that would help with disinformation, help election officials, solve some of the inconsistencies that create some of these issues. So for both of you, what are some ideas you have? What would you give if you were advising the National Council on Election Integrity? What are those issues that you would advise this group to kind of take forward and talk to Congress about going forward?
Well, I've been in this the election administration for nearly 30 years now, and so I lived through HAVA, I lived through the 2000 election, and I think right now we're very close to 2020, but when I look back at the emotion of 2000, I think the only thing we can all agree on in this room is half the country believes President Bush won and half the country believes that the election was stolen, and to this day, those of us who were in the thick of it, you can't change those points of view. So I think that, listening to what Stephen was saying, I'm trying to get people to see, it starts with the local stuff. Certainly, we've got to get people to see that elections are run by their neighbors and their friends and family, and educate them, and hopefully it goes up. But I think from a congressional level, when I think back on HAVA, the thing that HAVA did is the Help America Vote Act, it level set the finances. And I'm not advocating, because I can't do that in my job, and I'm not trying to promote that, but what the impact that the Help America Vote Act had on election offices is it made it even, because the disparity we had going into the 2000 election had so much more to do with local funding of election operations. And so if you were in a well-funded, if you're LA County, California, you are golden. You've got a lot of resources you can draw on. If you are Adams County, Washington, for your 8,000 voters, it's kind of a crapshoot. It depends on your local county commission. And that's true across the country. And so I mention that because I think it's got to come from Congress, and it has to be bipartisan, and it has to be working towards creating the resources for them to be able to implement whatever what did Senator Klobuchar say, the stick and the carrot, give the money and have those incentives to do things. But I think that it's that level setting of the resources I think would be the most powerful thing.
I think Trey may be really disappointed in me, and maybe Ben, and the libertarian side with me would be very disappointed, but national voter registration database is something that we are asked about a ton. Why don't you know when somebody immediately moved from California to Arizona? Why don't you know when somebody left Arizona? It's like, well, there isn't just like we just need to plug into this database and pull down. I understand that there are a lot of concerns about that, and I don't like as I've mentioned before, I don't like the idea of federalizing it, but I don't know how to solve that otherwise. And so I think it's something that needs to be thought of. Otherwise, volunteer coalitions like the ERIC Coalition, which I think has 33 states now, but importantly for Arizona, California is not part of that, and that's the #1 place from where people move to Arizona. In an ideal world, and I don't think this would pass, we would have a moratorium until every state would be given a deadline by when to have 100% of their votes tabulated, and no one would release results until that night. I think that if you look at the studies, that increasingly that time, we all know, stop the steal, stop the count was the cry of 2020 in places like Pennsylvania. And the number of myths I hear about, well, I went to bed and Donald Trump was winning, and I woke up and Donald Trump was losing. So if it was just like, snap, and there's all the results, I think that would give a lot less oxygen to a lot of this stuff. I know that would be very different, and I know that all the news desks in America would be like, you're depriving us of our favorite game ever. But I think it is something that might help the dialogue and might be healthier.
Well, thank you for both of those. And you know, what Stephen just said, too, about the disparities of states and the national voter registration. I mean, Texas doesn't even have online voter registration. You have to fill out a piece of paper in Texas to register to vote right now. They don't even have online. Most states have online, of course, but those are the kinds of examples that certainly are very bipartisan, create efficiency, and there's huge opportunity to think about that going forward. Same with the myth of Pennsylvania. They can't actually process mail ballots until 8 o'clock on election night. So of course it's going to take them a few days, because guess what? When you submit your taxes to the IRS, they don't have those results by April 16th. They take as long as they're going to take to get that done, and it's a people-driven process. So huge opportunities here, and thank you for both being on the panel today. We've got a little bit of time for a question, so Corey's got the mic, and looks like we've got a few around.
Hi, Carrie Levine from VoteBeat. Thanks for being here. Ms. Wyman, I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about CIS's approach to misinformation and disinformation. There was some reporting around the concerns that it was being viewed as increasingly partisan in the wake of the disinformation board at DHS. And so I was hoping you could just speak to how the agency is now approaching that.
Well, the disinformation board was DHS, and so I didn't have anything to do with that. CISA didn't have anything to do with that. In terms of our work on mis and disinformation is what I was saying earlier, really trying to focus on building that resilience and just making the American public aware that these tactics are being used on them actively, and then trying to amplify the state and local election officials as a trusted source. So that's really where we're focusing our work, and that continues to this day.
Thank you for being here. This question is really for Stephen. First of all, what you're doing is really impressive, and I just wanted to commend you for that. But secondarily to that, Arizona has been kind of a hotbed now of disputed elections and a lot of misinformation. How many actual cases of fraud were prosecuted in Arizona for the 2020 election?
It's under, let's say, under 50.
Okay.
3.4 million votes cast in 2020.
Right.
Yeah.
So my concern here, quite frankly, is that we're chasing a ghost. We keep telling people there's an election integrity problem, but we don't really have an election integrity problem. In many cases, we've got a candidate integrity problem. And we have an echo chamber that is pushing out so much misinformation about all these ballots that have been moved from this bucket to that bucket and under this table and that table. And if we keep telling voters that the elections are bad and we have to do all these reforms, we're almost playing into the information and playing into the idea that elections aren't safe. And it's my impression that they are. Am I wrong there?
You're not wrong. And in my time as administrator and in researching the subject, I have no reason to believe that there is any material inaccuracy, material fraud, or material voter disenfranchisement in Maricopa County, and that's something that should be celebrated. The proposals that I suggest are for perception, and unfortunately, perception has become reality for a good percentage of my state. And then yes, there are politicians who are unfortunately sort of behaving as rational actors, because I'm a dead man walking right now within my party. Because of this one position. And so until that changes, I don't think that people, it's hard to tell a politician. David Mayhew, from the famous political theorist, said politicians are single-minded seekers of re-election. And in that way, they're behaving very rational, and it takes a weirdo like me, which is why the few weirdos who are out there, like Liz Cheney, who will do this, but it's hard to ask that of politicians.
And let me just add one quick thing. So it is so minuscule. I mean, it is so rare, and there are prosecutions, but it is exceedingly rare, and it's usually driven by a mistake by a voter or by an election official. That's usually one of the two reasons. The biggest problem we have, which doesn't get talked about ever, is that in a presidential election, the most highly anticipated, highly watched, highly spent of our lifetime, 66% was the average turnout nationwide, which means 80 million voters that were eligible to vote, eligible age population, did not vote. That's actually more votes than the second place guy got. It is and it isn't. So when people get asked about that, those voters have been surveyed. 40% indicated they missed the voter registration deadline, forgot to sign up for a mail ballot, and then missed that deadline, couldn't get off work to go vote early, couldn't wait in line for 3 hours or whatever it was. So they indicate a barrier. A big chunk of them indicate a barrier, and then a lot of them indicate, I didn't want to vote for either one of those people. And there's, an independent streak there. But to me, we should be focused on that segment, because that's actually a big segment that tells us a lot of data about what we need to do from a policy perspective going forward. So, okay, go ahead.
Here's my challenge. I don't think we have an election integrity problem, but we have a huge election confidence problem. And we can do everything we want to make sure the elections are conducted picture perfect, but the reason we have the allegations of you're stealing the election is because we're counting elections days and days and weeks after the election occurred. And I can tell you, those people who are suspect of our process look at this and just say, that's proof. That's absolute proof. And I'm old enough now that I can say as a young kid, mainly with paper ballots, by the next morning, we knew the outcome of every election except those where there was going to be a recount. And with all the technology that we have to our hands, we all have to figure out, how do we count these elections, these races, so that when people wake up the day after the election, they know the outcome? Because if we continue this process of spreading it longer and longer and longer and give the excuses of why we do it, the people that we're trying to reach to be confident in the election process are not going to be confident. I trust it, but they don't. And I got people in my family who are absolutely convinced that these elections are fraudulent because look at the evidence. And you mentioned it, we go to bed, one person's ahead, all of a sudden, longer you wait, the more the opponent wins, whoever that is, And so we need your help. How do we expedite the counting process? How do we reclaim or instill in the American public confidence in what we're doing?
Well, welcome to Team Moratorium. Because the way it's currently designed, Western states won't have 97% plus results within 24 hours. In many Western states, you can postmark your ballot on Election Day. That means it's not getting there until 3 days after the election. Maricopa County, we had 295,000 early ballots that were dropped off on Election Day. We don't retrieve those ballots until 10 p.m. after polls have closed on election night. Those ballots have to be imaged, they have to be barcode scanned, they have to be signature verified, meaning that we have to actually have humans matching the signature verification. Then they have to be taken apart by law, by bipartisan teams, and then only sent then to tabulation. And if anyone has an overvote on the ballot, then it has to get kicked out to an adjudication board. So that's not happening in 48 hours unless you had thousands and thousands of people working on the process. So either you have to change the law to say you have to drop it off by Friday, 5 p.m., and that's a balance, as Kim mentioned, between accessibility and between having the results faster, or we have to go to something like nobody is releasing any results until we have the final results, and therefore we don't have this phenomenon of, again, the person who was in the lead at the beginning is not the person who ultimately won.
And I will say, every state was still processing ballots at the same time that Maricopa. In fact, Ohio had more ballots to process than the state of Nevada did a week after. They were still working on all their provisionals. So every state, Florida included, all of that, are still processing for weeks, which that doesn't get covered because they're not a swing state and they don't have all the disinfo. But I think the one final thing I'll say is if we want this to go faster, Congress needs to invest in sustainable funding for election officials, because it's all funded at the local level right now, and that should be agreeable, because that certainly is one way to speed things up, is more equipment, more people, more personnel, all those sorts of things can help.
Thank you, Amber and Stephen and Kim. Great panel. So what's next is lunch. You can smell it coming through the doors. And with that, we will have Senator Padilla speak, and also Zach is going to kind of reassemble his panel for another 10 or 15 minutes or so during lunch. I just want to go through a couple, because this morning's about learning. This afternoon, as you all know, we're going to gather just the council members and go through some ideas. But I just want to, having taken some notes this morning, just want to tick off a couple things. Number one, Senator Manchin, I think, was pretty clear about the notion of making it a federal felony to threaten election workers. Ben Ginsberg's 3 lessons learned were fantastic, and I'll get the list from him. Also, his kind of analogy that the fever broke, but the virus is still in the body. His idea that we need a sustained communications strategy to prove that denialism is not a good primary strategy. Senator Klobuchar was fantastic. Obviously, she talked about more money for U.S. elections. It was interesting to see her shift her position as she was questioned, because originally she was kind of talking about national standards and mandating them, but then she shifted to the idea of incentivizing best practices through additional federal funding. The idea of faster vote processing, as Steve was just hitting on, seems essential. As Kim and Stephen said, balancing cybersecurity and physical security and beefing both up. And then also fighting mis and disinformation. There's a lot more there, including the idea of a national voter registry database, which I think is really intriguing too, but just wanted to get some ideas on the table to begin teeing us up for the afternoon. So, Heather, where is the lunch? It's in the First Amendment room, right? Which is to the right?
Straight down the hall, all the way to the end, past the restroom.
All right, let's go eat.